If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 1, The Disdained Eldest Son. At the end of February, the Reach basked under a blazing sun, so intense that even the air seemed to ripple with heat. This endless summer had persisted for 7 long years, so long that all memories and caution of winter had gradually faded from people's minds. Following the picturesque Rose Road southward, all the way to its intersection with the ocean road, one could spot, on a hill beside the Mandar River, the most beautiful city on the continent of Westeros. Highgarden. Within the white marble castle, exquisite sculptures, unique fountains, and blooming flowers could be seen everywhere. And of course, golden roses were a must. They are the symbol of this castle's rulers, House Tyrell. Dong, dong, dong. Accompanied by the melodious sound of bells, 3 figures walked through the winding corridors and entered the Hall of Knights. However, the emblem on their chests was not the golden rose, but rather a hunter drawing his bow. This was the sigil of House Tarly. The man leading them looked to be about 40 years old, with a stern, unsmiling face, a short, bristly beard, a dark green silk tunic trimmed with white fur, and a heavy 2-handed great sword at his waist. This was none other than Lord Randall Tarly, the Lord of Hornhill. Following behind him were his 2 sons. His eldest, Samwell Tarly, and his younger son, Dickon Tarly. Both sons had inherited their father's dark hair, grey eyes, and tall stature, but Samwell was far too overweight. The stern, strong features typical of House Tarly held no trace of dignity on his round face. The noble tunic Samwell wore was almost suffocating him in the heat. But he didn't dare loosen the collar, so he endured it. The 3 stood in the center of the Hall of Knights, quietly waiting. Time ticked by, and Dickon seemed to grow impatient. He looked at his brother, who was staring off into space, and couldn't help but ask in a low voice. "What are you looking at?" "Stone columns," Samwell replied absent-mindedly. "What's so interesting about stone columns?" "These aren't just any stone columns," Samwell's lips curved slightly, a glint of nostalgia in his eyes. "These are the stone columns sung about by the minstrels." "Minstrels? I bet you snuck out for a drink last night, didn't you, big brother?" "Quiet." Lord Randall turned and glared at his sons. Dickon immediately fell silent. Samwell also lowered his head, but a hint of loneliness and melancholy passed through his eyes. 3 months had passed since he arrived in this world, and his sense of isolation was growing. But upon learning he was on the continent of Westeros and that he had somehow become the eldest son of House Tarly, he couldn't afford to wallow in self-pity. For Samwell Tarly, though he was the eldest son of an earl, he was despised by his own father. As one of the most skilled generals on Westeros, Lord Randall Tarly had countless illustrious victories to his name. His most famous was his defeat of Robert Baratheon, the founder of the Baratheon era, at the Battle of Ashford during the rebellion, marking the only defeat in the Warrior King's entire campaign. A proud, martial lord such as Randall could hardly tolerate a cowardly, rotund heir. While Samwell was not without his own merits, he was intelligent, well-read, and compassionate. Lord Randall insisted that the heir of his family must be a brave warrior, not a learned scholar. Samwell knew full well that in the original storyline, he would soon be forced by his father to take the black and become a Night's Watch, a man who could take no wife, father no children, and hold no lands, thus yielding the family inheritance to his more favored younger brother. He had no desire to go to that wretched place. At first, Samwell had tried to change everything. He controlled his eating, exercised diligently, and studied swordsmanship and horsemanship, hoping to improve his standing in his father's eyes. However, just as his excess weight couldn't be shed overnight, neither could his father's deeply rooted opinion of him change quickly. Before he could make much progress, his efforts were thwarted by a fall from a horse. Luckily, he hadn't been riding too fast, and his weight provided a cushion. The accident hadn't killed him but left him bedridden for over a month. The family's horse master called it an unfortunate accident. Samwell, however, suspected that someone had tampered with his saddle. Clearly, someone didn't want the useless eldest son of House Tarly to regain his footing. Samwell didn't know for sure who was responsible but had his suspicions. Lord Randall, for all his disdain, wouldn't stoop to such underhanded tactics. If he wanted to strip Samwell of his inheritance, he'd simply say it outright. And Dickon, his younger brother, was only 13. If he was already that scheming, ruthless, and cunning at this age, he'd be more fit to vie for the Iron Throne than to remain an obscure character as in the original storyline. Still, it likely wasn't Dickon himself but someone close to him. Samwell's failure had been a long-standing fact, and not only had Lord Randall given up on him, but many in the family had also come to see Dickon as the future lord. Unlike Samwell, who was overlooked and isolated, Dickon had amassed a circle of loyal supporters. If Samwell remained the family's disgrace, he might survive long enough to be forced to the wall by his father. But if he tried to prove himself and reclaim his right as heir, he'd face constant attacks and perhaps assassination. After the accident, Samwell finally understood that he had lost any advantage in this succession struggle and that any attempt to turn the tide would come with serious risks. In this situation, giving up seemed the wisest choice. Moreover, with his knowledge of future events, he held the greatest advantage in the coming Game of Thrones. Why trap himself in the losing battle for Hornhill? That said, even if he chose to surrender his claim, he would do so on his terms and seize reasonable benefits, rather than quietly awaiting the day his father would force him to the wall. So, once he recovered, Samwell approached his father and requested an official writ to claim new lands in the Reach from the Lord Paramount, Mace Tyrell. Lord Randall, hearing his son's request, thought he had misheard. He had never expected his cowardly son to have such courage and resolve. After some thought, he agreed. After all, if Samwell were to establish new lands, he'd be voluntarily surrendering his claim to Hornhill, something Randall had always wanted. He didn't actually believe his useless son could conquer new lands. But that didn't matter. If his son died in the process, he'd feel no sorrow, rather, he'd be pleased. That would be a fitting end for a Tarly. And so, the journey to Highgarden began for the father and his two sons. Tap, tap, tap. Clear footsteps echoed. Samwell turned and saw a red figure entering the Hall of Knights. It was a lovely young girl with brown eyes, as gentle as a fawn's. In a red silk gown that accentuated her slender, graceful curves, with soft brown curls cascading over her shoulders, her fair, snow-like skin seemed to glow against the fabric, her features delicate and captivating, a sight impossible to forget. This was Margaery Tyrell, daughter of Lord Mace Tyrell, the Rose of Highgarden. Chapter 2, The Knighthood. Apologies for the wait, Lord Tarly, Samwell, Dickon. Margaery lifted her skirt slightly and offered a polite bow, her radiant smile brightening the Hall of Knights. Samwell took only one look before lowering his head again. This beautiful woman was not someone he could desire. At least, not yet. But his brother Dickon openly gawked at the beautiful rose before him, oblivious to how rude he appeared. Lord Randall cleared his throat, snapping his love-struck son back to reality, and then asked Margaery, "When will the Duke arrive?" With an apologetic look, Margaery replied, "My father is unwell and cannot come today." "I am terribly sorry." Lord Randall frowned. "If that's the case, let us reschedule." Margaery, however, shook her head and produced a scroll from behind her, saying with a smile, "There's no need to reschedule. My father has already signed the writ of expansion and entrusted me to deliver it. And the knighting ceremony? I will conduct the knighting in my father's place." At this, the Hall of Knights fell silent. Dickon still looked confused, but both Lord Randall and Samwell realized that Duke Mace Tyrell was deliberately avoiding them. This wasn't too surprising, in truth. After so many years of expansion and development in the Reach, there was hardly any unclaimed land left. Any new territory would have to be taken from the barren lands along the borders, such as the Red Mountains. That area was a true wilderness, plagued by bandits and raiders. Even if it had some potential for development, establishing a holding there would be a task too daunting for most. The reputation of House Tarly's cowardly eldest son was no secret among the nobility of the Reach. No one would believe Samwell capable of developing new lands. The only reason Duke Mace had even agreed to grant the writ was because Lord Randall had personally come to ask for it. Moreover, bestowing the writ would make Samwell a direct vassal of Duke Mace Tyrell, meaning that in theory, Duke Mace should knight Samwell Tarly personally. However, it was clear that the Duke did not want Samwell as his sworn knight. Thus, he feigned illness, sending his daughter to perform the knighting and deliver the writ. Lord Randall could somewhat understand Duke Mace's reluctance. If he had sent his eldest son and heir, Willis Tyrell, in his stead, Lord Randall might have accepted it. But Margaery? What qualifications did she have to knight anyone? The insult was almost too much for Lord Randall, who could not hide his anger, even for his disdained eldest son. He glared at Margaery coldly, making no effort to conceal his anger. Margaery maintained a gentle, innocent smile, as though oblivious to Lord Randall's displeasure. As the tension in the room grew heavier, Samwell broke the silence. "In that case, Lady Marjorie, I'll leave it to you. Samwell felt the sting of insult but knew that a weak man's anger was meaningless. Besides, he hadn't forgotten his true goal in coming here, securing the writ. He would not let pride cost him something so essential. The struggles of his past life had taught him the value of patience when necessary. At Samwell's words, Marjorie looked at him with a hint of surprise, then smiled and said, "Very well, let us begin." Lord Randall shot his son a look of disdain, as if to say, "You would actually accept a knighting from a woman?" But since Samwell himself had agreed, there was little more he could say. Marjorie stepped up onto the raised platform at the front of the hall, while Samwell knelt on one knee before her. A shaft of light streamed down through the stained glass ceiling, casting a holy aura over them. Samwell drew his sword and held it above his head in both hands. Marjorie was about to take it when Lord Randall interjected. "To knight a Tarly, one must use Heart's Bane." Clang! Lord Randall drew the massive long sword from his side and extended it toward Marjorie. This Valyrian steel sword, Heart's Bane, had been in House Tarly for over 500 years, weighing over 30 pounds, a challenge for even the strongest fighters to wield in battle. As for a sheltered noblewoman, she could barely even lift it. Lord Randall was clearly trying to make Marjorie look foolish, venting his frustration. Yet Marjorie only smiled and extended her pale, slender hands. Clink! The sword tip struck the marble floor, though she managed to grip the hilt tightly. With a deep breath, she used all her strength to lift the great sword, resting it on Samwell's shoulder. "Ah! Truly, the sword of House Tarly is remarkable. No wonder Lord Randall can dominate the battlefield with it," she said, to which Lord Randall responded only with a curt huff, stepping back. Marjorie then looked down at the knight kneeling before her and was about to begin reciting the oath when she paused, asking, "By the way, Sir Samwell, do you intend to keep the Tarly name or adopt a new one?" After becoming a pioneer lord, Samwell indeed had the option of creating a new family name, formally separating from the Tarlys of Hornhill. Samwell hesitated. He kept his head low, his body beginning to tremble slightly. Seeing this, Marjorie thought he was struggling under the sword's weight and applied a little more support. In truth, Samwell was shaking not from the sword's weight, but from excitement. For he had just glimpsed familiar square characters. Earth language. A language not of this world. In the lower right corner of his vision, these words appeared the moment the ceremony began, words that seemed foreign to this world. He had to focus to make them out. Samwell Tarly. Title, Pioneer Knight. Territory, none. Vassals, none. Strength, 1.08. Agility, 0.52. Willpower, 1.12. What was this? Could it be a status panel? A wave of joy surged through Samwell, as powerful as a landslide, breaking through the patience he had forced upon himself since arriving in this world. At that moment, all his bottled-up emotions, anger, fear, humiliation, worry boiled over, forming a burning ambition. Where before he'd planned to rely on his knowledge of the storyline to survive, perhaps attaching himself to a powerful figure and biding his time, now he felt a new desire arise within him. An ambition for that twisted, jagged throne of iron, forged from 1,000 melted blades. "I've decided on my new family name," Samwell said, lifting his gaze to meet Marjorie's fawn-like brown eyes with a bold, steady look. "Caesar. From now on, I am Samwell Caesar." Marjorie froze. For an instant, she thought she saw a spark in this man's eyes. But she quickly recovered, confirming the originality of his chosen name, then smiled warmly and spoke with solemnity. "I, Marjorie Tyrell, daughter of Mace Tyrell, in the name of the Lord of the Reach, Warden of the South, and Duke of Highgarden, hereby knight Samwell Caesar as a pioneer knight. All unclaimed lands in the Reach are open to you to develop, and all unbound people are yours to protect. May the Father grant you justice, the Mother grant you mercy, the Warrior grant you courage, the Crone grant you wisdom, and the Stranger grant you victory over all foes. I, Samwell Caesar, under the watchful eyes of the Seven, in the spirit of my noble ancestor Garth Greenhand, pledge my loyalty to the great Duke Mace Tyrell. From this day forth, your will shall be my creed, and the direction of your sword, my path. I vow to guard this honor with my life." Chapter 3, The Status Panel. After the knighting ceremony, Marjorie gracefully departed. Dickon had also been dismissed by their father. In the empty hall of knights, only Lord Randall Tarly and Samwell Caesar remained. Father and son faced each other in silence, with the tense, heavy atmosphere filling the air. Samwell, eager to return and examine his newly discovered status panel, broke the silence first. "Father, is there anything you wish to tell me? You hate me." Lord Randall looked at his son, speaking suddenly. Before Samwell could respond, he continued, "Don't bother denying it, I don't care." Samwell's mouth twitched, but he stayed silent. Lord Randall's gaze on his son held an unusual, almost unrecognizable glimmer, though his tone remained as cold as ever. "If a hunter returns empty-handed, his family goes hungry. If a lord suffers defeat, his castle will be burned to the ground. Over the centuries, countless families in Westeros have vanished from history simply because of a weak and incompetent heir. Here on the borderlands, House Tarly needs a lord who can wield Heartsbane in battle. And you don't even have the right to touch it. So, no matter how much you may hate me, I will never entrust this family's fate to you." Samwell listened quietly, feeling no great resentment. After all, the original Samwell did fall short of his father's standards for an heir, and though he had tried to change things since arriving here, it was simply too late. But that was all in the past now. After the ceremony, he had taken the name Caesar, cutting all ties with House Tarly. At that moment, Lord Randall tossed something toward him. Samwell caught it quickly and looked down, surprised to find a large bag filled with gold dragons. "Since you voluntarily surrendered your inheritance, this is your share," Lord Randall explained indifferently. "Thank you, father." Samwell readily accepted it. He needed funds for his new venture. "Also, before your departure, I personally dealt with your horse master, James." Samwell was stunned but quickly pieced it together. James must have been the one behind the incident that had caused him to fall from his horse. His father had not only found him out but had killed him. "No matter how useless you are still the eldest son of House Tarly. If you are to be judged, it will be by my own hand," Lord Randall declared, unyielding. Samwell felt a mix of emotions, bowing his head in silence. Whatever his father's flaws, this was, in a way, vengeance on his behalf. After a brief pause, Lord Randall spoke again. "Samwell, do you remember our family words?" Samwell nodded. "First in battle." As soon as he uttered the words, he understood why his father was so set on choosing a different heir. Samwell as he had once been would never have been able to live up to those words. Lord Randall's expression softened slightly. "Though you no longer bear the Tarly name, I still hope you will remember these words. Schemes and lies may win political victories, but when it comes to true mastery on the battlefield, House Tarly has the real expertise. Since you had the courage to accept the writ of expansion, it shows that Tarly blood still runs in your veins. Keep this saying in mind. In the challenges of developing new lands, it will serve you better than gold." Samwell nodded solemnly, warmth stirring within him. But then Lord Randall's next words were as cold as ice water. "If you fail to conquer this new land, do not return to Horn Hill. If you do, I'll take your head myself." With that, Lord Randall turned and strode away. Samwell watched his father's tall figure retreat, his expression a mix of emotions. Finally, he let out a wry chuckle and rolled his eyes. In a garden filled with blooming flowers, Samwell gripped a silver longsword, practicing thrusts against an ironwood target. Unfortunately, his bulk made his movements ungainly and severely hindered his speed. Before long, his footwork was a chaotic mess. But Samwell did not give up and continued awkwardly. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, his clothes were drenched in sweat, and he finally stopped. He staggered over to the steps, sat down, and gulped down some water. Once he'd caught his breath, he focused his gaze on his status panel. The numbers hadn't changed much, except for a small increase in agility, from 0.52 to 0.53. It seemed his guess was correct. Training could indeed improve his attributes. However, the change was hardly significant. A whole afternoon of thrust practice had increased his agility by just 0.01, while strength and willpower hadn't changed at all. Perhaps there had been some change, but it was too small to register on the panel, as the values only went to 2 decimal places. Agility had likely increased because it was his lowest stat, making it easier to improve. Samwell guessed that a typical adult's stats would each average around 1.0. Given his weight, his agility was significantly below normal. His strength, however, was slightly above average, since he needed it to move his own bulk. His highest stat was willpower at 1.12, likely due to the original Samwell's intelligence and love for reading. The meaning of strength and agility was clear enough, but Samwell wasn't sure about willpower. He suspected it might relate to the legendary but mostly forgotten magic of this world. After all, this was a fantasy realm, with dragons, White Walkers, the children of the forest, sorcerers, and the old and new gods. While many magical beings had either gone extinct or faded into legend, with miracles scarcely seen on Westeros in ages, with summer ending and winter approaching, the Game of Thrones would soon resume, and the world of mysticism would gradually reawaken. Perhaps if he raised his willpower to a certain level, he could unlock some of these mystical secrets. But that was the problem, Samwell hadn't yet found a way to add points directly. Through nightly training, he could slowly improve his strength and agility, but the process was painfully slow. As these stats increased, it would become even harder to make progress. As for willpower, could reading actually raise it? Still, Samwell felt encouraged. Even if he couldn't directly add points, quantifying his attributes was immensely helpful. He could experiment with different methods, observing the changes in his stats to find the most effective way to improve. For example, with the swordsmanship of House Tarly, he could refine and perfect it based on feedback from his status panel. Moreover, while he couldn't add points now, who's to say he wouldn't be able to in the future? Samwell guessed that once he successfully established a domain and recruited some vassals, the status panel might unlock new functions, perhaps even allowing him to add points directly. Lost in thought, planning with renewed ambition, Samwell suddenly heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see a maid approaching, who bowed respectfully and said, "Sir Caesar, the steward asked me to remind you that the banquet begins at 6 in the main hall of the keep." "Very well." Samwell rose and instructed, "Prepare hot water for my bath." "At once, Sir." Chapter 4, The Banquet. By the time Samwell entered the banquet hall, the evening sun's glow had nearly faded. Thousands of scented candles illuminated the hall as though it were daylight, and thick woolen carpets covered the floor, soft and plush underfoot, like walking on clouds. In the spacious hall, long wooden tables were set up, each draped with navy blue velvet cloth and adorned with fresh roses of various colors. A gentle fragrance filled the air, refreshing and soothing. An elegantly dressed attendant led Samwell to his seat and poured him a glass of golden arbor wine. Although the banquet had not yet officially started, a considerable number of guests had already arrived, chatting softly in small groups. Lord Randall and his younger brother, Dickon, were also present, though their seats were not arranged near Samwell. Lord Randall seemed not to notice his eldest son's arrival, sipping his wine in silence. Dickon, however, waved at his brother, looking like he wanted to come over to talk. But after glancing at his stern-faced father, he didn't dare move. Before long, the host of the castle finally appeared. The Duke of Highgarden looked to be in his 50s, his curly brown hair a trait of House Tyrell streaked with grey. Broad-shouldered and stout, he'd earned the mocking nickname Lord Fat Flower behind closed doors. Yet Lord Fat Flower looked healthy, his face ruddy, voice strong, and stride confident, showing no signs of illness. He didn't even bother to fake it. Samwell muttered internally, though he rose along with everyone else to greet the Duke. As Duke Mace took his place at the head of the table, the banquet began in earnest. Graceful young maidens glided between the tables like butterflies, serving delicious dishes one after another. Salmon salad, roasted venison leg, seared lamprey, creamy chestnut soup, honeyed pine nut cake, freshly picked strawberries, and even a rare dish of golden tail shrimp. Samwell's appetite was thoroughly stirred. This banquet was ostensibly held to celebrate Samwell's new title as Pioneer Knight. However, Duke Mace barely concealed his disdain for House Tarly's worthless eldest son. After a cursory introduction, he quickly shifted the topic. Everyone knew Samwell's title was merely a formality and excuse for Lord Randall to replace his heir. No one believed this infamous fool of the Reach would actually conquer new land. Some even whispered, chuckling over tales of the knight knighted by a woman. Samwell ignored the gossip and focused on the feast. When he peeled the shell off a golden tail shrimp and bit into the tender, juicy meat, he suddenly froze. His strength attribute had increased by 0.01. Could eating increase attributes? Samwell was thrilled and quickly devoured the rest of his food. However, his attributes didn't change further. After taking a sip of wine and mulling it over, he formed a hypothesis. He called over a nearby maid and asked, "Could you please bring me another serving of golden tail shrimp?" The maid looked at the plump knight before her, suppressing a smile as she nodded. "Of course, sir, just a moment." When the second plate of golden tail shrimp arrived, Samwell eagerly dug in. Sure enough, his strength increased by another 0.01. It really was the golden tail shrimp that was increasing his strength. Elated, Samwell called for the maid again, ignoring the disapproving glances from around him, and ordered another portion. He knew that golden tail shrimp was an extremely rare delicacy. Once he left the Duke's residence, getting his hands on more would be expensive and difficult. So, what need was there to worry about noble manners or etiquette? Besides, he had little dignity left to preserve in the eyes of the nobles of the Reach. However, after Samwell finished his third golden tail shrimp and seemed ready to order a fourth, even Duke Mace couldn't hold back, chuckling as he asked. Samwell, are the golden tail shrimp that delicious? Unfazed, Samwell wiped his mouth with a napkin, stood, and respectfully replied, Yes, Your Grace. This is the finest dish I've ever tasted. I apologize for my poor restraint. Faced with Samwell's shamelessness and flattery, Duke Mace was at a loss for words. To say more might make him seem a stingy host. Well then, eat your fill but don't eat so much that you can't mount a horse tomorrow. Ha ha ha. Pleased with his own jest, Duke Mace laughed heartily, his expression as pleased as a pumpkin at harvest. The other guests laughed along, filling the hall with an air of merriment. Samwell ignored their laughter and loudly thanked the Duke for his generosity, before turning back to the maid and saying, Another plate of golden tail shrimp, please. If they were already laughing at him, why not make the most of it? But just then, the steward approached, looking apologetic. My sincerest apologies, sire, but the golden tail shrimp is all gone. Samwell suspected the man was simply unwilling to serve him more, but he could only sigh and drop the matter. Duke Mace suddenly chuckled again. Samwell, the kitchen still has plenty of venison. Care for some? Who wants venison? Samwell was about to decline when the Duke's mother, the Queen of Thorns, Lady Olenna Redwine, suddenly spoke up. I've never been fond of seafood with shells. Samwell, if you don't mind, you may have my portion. Samwell glanced at the petite, silver-haired lady, surprised. He wondered why the famously sharp-tongued Queen of Thorns was being so gracious toward him. He was hardly a promising young knight, and he had nothing she could possibly want. Outwardly, though, Samwell put on a look of honor and smiled as he bowed. Lady Olenna's gift I would never refuse. Good, good, Olenna smiled. A fine knight must have a fine appetite. Take it, then. The maid was about to serve Olenna's shrimp to Samwell, but Olenna signaled to her granddaughter Marjorie instead. Marjorie immediately understood, personally lifting the plate and walking it over to Samwell. She, too, was puzzled as to why her grandmother was being so courteous to Samwell, but as a shrewd young woman, she kept her curiosity hidden, following Olenna's lead in this show of favor. Samwell, deeply honored, stood and expressed his gratitude. You are a knight of my own making. There's no need for such formality. Marjorie set the silver plate before him with a gentle smile, graceful as ever. This evening, the Duke's daughter was dressed in a pure white satin gown that hugged her figure, showcasing every alluring curve. Her elaborate gold headpiece, sapphire necklace, and tiered silk chiffon skirt radiated opulence unique to the upper nobility. One look, and the gap in social rank was clear, leaving one feeling utterly unworthy. But here was the most beautiful rose of Highgarden, personally serving a supposed buffoon. This sight left everyone in the hall stunned. The young men, in particular, shot seething glares that could have roasted Samwell. Yet, while Marjorie's approach delighted Samwell on the surface, he couldn't help but feel wary. Naturally, he played the part of a timid young man, looking awestruck yet bashfully thrilled by the attention of a noble lady. Watching Samwell's awkwardness in the face of her granddaughter's charms, Olenna's lips curved with amusement. Samwell, where will you begin your expansion? Do you have a target in mind? Honored Lady Olenna, I haven't decided yet. Since you don't yet have a plan, I have a suggestion. Samwell's guard shot up. People say all gifts from fate are priced in advance, and it was clear that the Queen of Thorns wasn't offering her favor for free. Still, he'd already accepted her golden tail shrimp, and he was on her turf, so rejecting her wasn't an option. He said. Please, go ahead. Olenna only shook her head, teasingly withholding her idea. This isn't the place for such talk. Come find me tomorrow, and we'll discuss it in detail. Certainly, my lady. Chapter 5, Support. All right, this is as far as I'll go. Early the next morning, at Highgarden's gates, Lord Randall stopped his eldest son. Samwell halted, smiling as he said, "Father, Dickon, take care on your journey." Dickon stepped forward and gave Samwell a bear hug, saying, "Brother, remember to visit me at Hornhill often." Samwell's mind flashed to his father's warning not to return, making him awkwardly smile as he gave his brother a nod. Lord Randall motioned for Dickon and the guards to go ahead, staying behind alone. Samwell knew his father had something more to say. After a pause, Lord Randall spoke. "Beware of the women of House Tyrell." Samwell looked at him in surprise. Without waiting for him to respond, Lord Randall continued. "They're intelligent but often fail to understand their place." Having said this, he didn't elaborate further and turned to leave. Samwell watched his father's departing figure, thoughtful. In the show, he hadn't paid much attention to Lord Randall, he only remembered that he was a skilled warrior. But after these recent encounters, Samwell realized there was more to this Lord of Hornhill than met the eye. Randall Tarley may have disdained intrigue and refrained from vying for the Iron Throne, appearing merely as a loyal, formidable ally to House Tyrell. However, looking back, Samwell recalled that this low-profile lord had eventually, and quietly, entered the small council as the master of laws. Clearly, this was no ordinary military man. And his warning to Samwell was undoubtedly connected to Lady Olenna's remarks from the previous night's banquet. Even though he'd given up on his eldest son, Lord Randall didn't want him exploited by House Tyrell's women. Samwell would have been cautious even without his father's warning. He knew very well that while the men of House Tyrell were politically average, the women, especially Lady Olenna, the Queen of Thorns, and Marjorie, the Rose of Highgarden, were skilled players in the game of power. There was certainly a motive behind their approach. But Samwell wasn't overly concerned. After all, he knew the story's plot and was fully aware of the Tyrell women's ambitions. They, in contrast, saw him merely as a weak, discarded son, unwanted by his own father. This knowledge gap was his advantage. With this thought, Samwell composed himself and returned to the castle. A maid led him to a courtyard, where Lady Olenna was waiting. Upon entering, he saw that Marjorie was also present. The Rose of Highgarden was standing among the rose bushes, her slender, fair fingers delicately placing a freshly cut golden rose into a mostly finished bouquet. Focused, with her refined nose and gently pursed red lips, Marjorie radiated a quiet elegance. Even standing off to the side, she commanded the center of the courtyard. Hearing Samwell's footsteps, Marjorie looked up and smiled, then lifted the basket and walked over to him. "Sir Samwell, how do you like the bouquet I made?" Samwell placed a hand over his heart and bowed. "As beautiful as you, my lady." "Then it's yours, my knight." Samwell quickly accepted it, bowing and murmuring his thanks, as if he didn't dare to meet her gaze. Following Marjorie, he entered the pavilion in the center of the garden. Lady Olenna sat sipping honeyed tea, smiling as she watched Samwell approach. She gestured for him to sit. "Please, young knight." Samwell stepped forward, offered a respectful bow, and then sat across from her. "Honored Lady Olenna, what can I do for you?" "This is about your expansion. If you haven't chosen a location, I have a suggestion." "Please, go ahead." Lady Olenna spread a map she had prepared onto the table, pointing to a spot and drawing a circle. "I suggest you consider expanding here." Samwell peered at the map and saw that she had indicated a location in the southern reach, on the western slopes of the Red Mountains, near the summer sea and close to the mouth of the Torrentine River. "This area?" Samwell rubbed his chin and asked humbly. "My lady, why do you suggest I expand here?" Lady Olenna took a sip of her tea, smiling as she said. "Most undeveloped land in the Reach lies within the Red Mountains. The location I suggested is near the mouth of the Torrentine, convenient for future maritime trade." Samwell nodded, though he still appeared hesitant. "But, my lady, the Red Mountains are rugged and difficult. Building a castle there could be challenging." Lady Olenna smiled. "Have you forgotten where Casterly Rock and the Eyrie are built? A fortress in the mountains is tough to construct but far easier to defend. Besides, the Red Mountains are home to many free folk who despise the nobility of the Reach and refuse to become our subjects. But if you could win their loyalty, your lands would never want for population." Samwell knew that by free folk, Lady Olenna was referring to the mountain clans. These people, descendants of the Andals and First Men, had dark complexions and short stature. Rejecting feudal rule, they hid in the vast Red Mountains, living in primitive tribes. They survived by hunting and gathering but frequently raided nearby villages and towns. Many of the Reach's nobles had tried to eradicate these clans, only to fail repeatedly. The Red Mountains were simply too large, the clans could vanish into its depths, only to re-emerge once the soldiers left, raiding again. These mountain folk were Samwell's greatest challenge in his expansion. But as Lady Olenna explained, if he could win their loyalty, they'd provide a substantial population for his new territory. Samwell awkwardly scratched the back of his head, putting on a timid expression. "But, my lady, I'm afraid I'd be torn to pieces by the fierce mountain folk before I even found my footing. House Tarly is known for its warrior prowess. I have no doubt you'll rise to the challenge." Not waiting for Samwell to reply, Lady Olenna added. "Besides, the Tyrells have long wished to deal with the mountain clans. If you accept my proposal, I'll assign 100 soldiers from our household guard to aid in your expansion." Samwell's eyes lit up, swallowing his objections. After Lady Olenna pointed to the spot on the map, he'd begun to suspect her intentions. She clearly wished to use and control him. But Samwell, in turn, hoped to borrow the Tyrell's resources for his expansion. Those 100 soldiers were invaluable to him. If he could just negotiate for a few more. Feigning shyness, he muttered, 100 soldiers, wouldn't that be a bit few, my lady? A bit few. Lady Olenna's tone grew slightly impatient. When Garth Greenhand came to Highgarden in the Age of Heroes, he didn't even have 100 men with him. Marjorie joined in, smiling as she said. "Samwell, I'm sure with your abilities, you'll succeed in establishing a thriving territory. And here my personal savings can help you get started." She produced a deep green coin pouch and pressed it into his hands. Feeling the weighty pouch, Samwell put on a look of inspiration, pounding his chest and pledging not to disappoint Lady Olenna and Lady Marjorie. Lady Olenna smiled in satisfaction, even ordering the steward to pack 5 golden tail shrimp for Samwell to take with him. Samwell gladly accepted. After he left, Marjorie took a seat beside her grandmother, wrapping her arms around her and asking, "Grandmother, why send Samwell to expand in that area? If you didn't know my intention, why contribute your own savings?" Marjorie laughed and hugged Olenna's arm. "It's my duty to support your plans, isn't it? The reason itself doesn't matter. I trust you completely. You sly fox." Lady Olenna playfully tapped her granddaughter's nose. "But take a guess at my intention." Marjorie glanced at the map. "Is it because of Dorne?" "Smart girl," Olenna nodded approvingly. "Then why not send a brave knight instead of someone like Samwell? It is a key location, yes, but it's a poor, barren land. Adding in the mountain clans' attacks and proximity to Dorne, ordinary expansion methods wouldn't work there. So, I need the reputation of this discarded Tarly to allow for some, unconventional means." Lady Olenna explained vaguely. Marjorie frowned. "But grandmother, using a member of House Tarly like this, isn't it rather improper?" "Improper?" Olenna scoffed. "Without our support, you think that abandoned fool could establish anything on his own? Naturally, our help has a price, but it's one he must pay." Lady Olenna gazed out at the lush courtyard, then sighed softly. "The more beautiful the rose, the sharper the thorns it needs. If I won't take these steps, do you expect your foolish father to?" Chapter 6, Recruiting Soldiers. Honorable Lord Caesar, Todd Flowers, at Lady Olenna's command, reporting for duty. Samwell looked at the knight bowing before him and the 100 Tyrell soldiers behind him, unable to hide his surprise. He had assumed Lady Olenna's promised 100 soldiers would be conscripted men, farmers barely familiar with a sword, freshly pulled from their fields. But the men before him, with their synchronized movements and fierce, battle-hardened demeanor, were clearly House Tyrell's trained soldiers. They were outfitted with full gear, leather armor, swords, shields, spears, and bows, everything they'd need. A unit like this, fully armed and ready for battle, could easily take down a small lord's lands, and Lady Olenna had entrusted them all to him? Samwell realized he had likely underestimated the determination and resources of the Queen of Thorns. Of course, she had also underestimated him. He wasn't about to be anyone's pawn so easily. Looking over the Tyrell soldiers, a glint of excitement shone in Samwell's eyes. He would show these Tyrell women what it meant to throw. No, why was he criticizing himself? Collecting his thoughts, Samwell took a closer look at the soldiers' leader, Sir Todd Flowers. This man looked to be in his 30s, tall and weathered, with a striking scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. But what intrigued Samwell most was his last name, Flowers. Each of the 7 kingdoms in Westeros had a traditional surname for highborn bastards: Snow in the north, Rivers in the Riverlands, Sand in Dorne, and Flowers in the Reach. In Westeros, being born illegitimate didn't necessarily mean a life of insignificance. With a royal decree, they could be legitimized and gain inheritance rights only slightly behind true-born heirs. In fact, several bastards had influenced the course of Westeros's history, such as the Bloodraven Brynden Rivers and Jon Snow, soon to be a major character in the story. So, Samwell was quite curious about which noble in the Reach had sired this Todd Flowers. When Samwell remained silent, Todd looked up and asked, "Lord Caesar, we're all ready. Should we depart right away?" Samwell smiled. "Not yet. I need to recruit a few more men." Todd frowned. "You're recruiting more?" "Yes," Samwell replied, feigning anxiety. "The Red Mountains are full of wild beasts and hostile mountain clans. I'll need more men to feel safe." Todd mentally cursed House Tarly's infamous worthless eldest son, but could only follow Samwell as he led the way into town. After a while, Todd grew suspicious and asked, "Lord Caesar, aren't we going to the mercenaries' camp?" "No." Without further explanation, Samwell continued walking. Before long, they arrived at the docks along the Mander River. It was midday, and with the sweltering heat, most of the dock workers were taking shelter in the shade. Samwell turned to Todd. "Send a few men to tell these workers that I, Samwell Caesar, under Duke Mace's command, am heading to the Red Mountains to claim new lands. Anyone willing to join will be provided with food and drink, including 1 meal with meat each day. In addition, I'll pay a wage of 70 copper pennies a month, and should any die in service, their families will receive a compensation of 5 silver stags." Todd hesitated. "My lord, isn't that a bit generous for these people?" Samwell waved dismissively, a confident expression on his face. "A generous lord gathers loyal men. Go on, do as I say." "Yes, my lord." Soon, word spread across the docks that Samwell Caesar was recruiting for an expedition to the Red Mountains. 1 meal with meat every day? 70 copper pennies per month, and 5 silver stags if you die? Are you sure? Absolutely. The whole dock is talking about it. Could it be a scam? Gavin frowned. Caesar? I've never heard of that family name. Do you know every noble in the Reach? A friend scoffed. And it can't be a scam, look at those soldiers standing over there. Go see for yourself if you don't believe it. Gavin hesitated no longer and hurried over with the others. In no time, nearly every dock worker had gathered. Clearly, such generous terms were enough to make these poor commoners eager for the chance. They'd have been willing to brave fire and sword for less. Standing on a raised platform, Samwell looked over the sea of people and raised his voice. "I am Samwell Caesar, the recently appointed pioneer knight by Duke Mace himself. Today, I'm recruiting men to join me in claiming new lands in the Red Mountains. But I won't take everyone, there are requirements. First, you must be between 18 and 35 years old." With that, a number of men left disappointed. The crowd thinned somewhat, but hundreds still remained. Samwell then pointed to a distant lighthouse and said, "Now, run to that lighthouse as fast as you can and back here." Some stood confused, but those quick to understand the purpose of the exercise took off running immediately. Samwell observed them, and as the first runners returned, he had Todd send men to halt those still lagging behind, telling them they'd been disqualified. Counting the remaining men, Samwell realized he still had more than he could afford. He couldn't sustain too many soldiers, and technically, as Tyrell vassals, he should have sought Duke Mace's permission before recruiting them. But he had no desire to approach the fat lord, who clearly didn't like him, and risk being refused. So he planned to recruit around 100 men without official approval. This number was small enough that Duke Mace would likely overlook it. Moving to a higher spot before the crowd, Samwell raised his sword horizontally before him and ordered the remaining men to walk under it, one by one. For those who could pass beneath it without touching the blade, he declared, "You are recruited." For those too short to reach the sword, he simply shook his head. "Sorry, you didn't make it." Gavin, observing from the sidelines, quickly realized this noble was using height as the final selection criterion. He grew nervous. When it was finally his turn, Gavin bit his lip and stepped forward. As he approached the sword, he felt a surge of hopelessness. It was just as he feared, he wasn't tall enough. But as he walked beneath it, he rose onto his tiptoes, closing his eyes. He knew this small trick could easily be spotted, but he didn't care. He wouldn't give up. Born in the slums, he had long dreamed of becoming a knight's squire. But what noble would choose a commoner with no name? This time, hearing that a knight was setting out to claim new lands, Gavin's hope had reignited. He knew the dangers of frontier life, but success would bring new noble houses. He didn't expect to become a noble himself, but he hoped to prove himself worthy of becoming a knight's squire. Now, that dream seemed to be slipping away again. Holding his breath, Gavin waited for his fate to be decided. Strangely, the knight's voice didn't come. Gavin dared not look back but refused to step down, standing stubbornly on tiptoe. Seconds ticked by, and his legs began trembling, his face flushed red, and beads of sweat trickled down his face, but he held his ground. Samwell, watching this young man's attempted trick, didn't disqualify him, wanting to see how long he'd last on his tiptoes. The midday sun was relentless, evaporating the droplets of sweat before they hit the ground. Samwell, standing normally, already felt his legs growing tired, yet the young man before him kept going. His whole body shook, on the verge of collapse, but he wouldn't yield. Finally, as Gavin's vision began to blur, he heard a voice like a miracle. "Very well. You're recruited." With a thud, Gavin dropped to his knees, gasping for air like a fish out of water. Then, he saw the knight kneeling beside him, a warm smile on his round face. "Boy, what's your name?" My lord, I'm Gavin." "All right, Gavin. From today on, you'll be in charge of leading my horse." Gavin's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, my lord." Chapter 7, I'm not short on money. To the Honourable Lady Marjorie Tyrell. I shouldn't trouble you with such trivial matters, but since you are the sponsor of this expedition, I felt it my duty to keep you informed of our progress. After we parted, I met Sir Todd Flowers and the 100 Tyrell soldiers. They are outstanding warriors, and I kindly ask that you convey my gratitude to Lady Olenna on my behalf. Additionally, I recruited 108 dock workers, who I believe will play an important role in this endeavour. After a day's stay in Highgarden to gather supplies and gear, we set off. Following the Rose Road southward, we reached the area near Honeyholt after nearly a month. We planned to rest here briefly before leaving the Rose Road to head further south. However, we have encountered a problem. I'm embarrassed to admit it, but it is indeed my oversight. I hadn't anticipated how quickly provisions would be consumed by a force of over 200, especially with my promise of a daily meat ration for the newly recruited soldiers. I fear that, at this rate, I'll be bankrupt before reaching the Red Mountains. After much deliberation, I decided to write you this letter and humbly ask for your support. I am well aware that this is an unreasonable request, and if you should refuse, I will harbour no resentment, though this expedition will likely come to an untimely end. Your most loyal knight, Samwell Caesar. In a rose-filled garden, Marjorie sat on a swing, the gentle breeze lifting her brown curls as she frowned at the letter in her hands, a sight that would easily stir pity. "What's troubling you? Which knight's letter has our little princess so lost in thought?" The speaker was a young man with a calm air, sitting in a wheelchair with a thin face and a neatly trimmed beard. This was Willis Tyrell, the heir to Highgarden and Marjorie's older brother. "It's not what you think, brother." Marjorie jumped off the swing and handed the letter to Willis, pouting. "It's from Samwell Tarley. That man actually wrote to ask me for money. And he's only reached Honeyholt after all this time. What has he been doing? Sightseeing?" "Samwell? Oh, I remember him." Willis skimmed the letter, a trace of amusement showing. "The pioneer knight with a fondness for golden tail shrimp? And you're funding him?" "I'm just helping grandmother with her plans." Willis furrowed his brow. "I haven't asked before, but why did grandmother send Sir Todd and 100 of our household guards to assist this man with his expedition? What is her goal?" Marjorie shrugged. "I don't fully know either. I only know it has something to do with Dorne." "Dorne?" Willis lowered his head, glancing at his injured leg. Located in the southernmost part of Westeros, Dorne was separated from the Reach by the Red Mountains. Neighbouring regions often spark conflict, and Dorne's feud with the Reach spanned over 1,000 years. Legend has it that the Red Mountains were once green but turned crimson from the blood of fallen soldiers in their centuries-long war. And Willis's leg had been injured by Prince Oberyn Martell of Dorne during a tourney, further fueling the rivalry between the Tyrells and the Martells. Seeing her brother's pensive look, Marjorie took his hand, comforting him. "Don't worry, brother. We'll make House Martell pay." But Willis only smiled, shaking his head. "In truth, I don't hate him. Honestly. He defeated me honorably in the tourney, I hold no grudges. You may not believe this, but we still write to each other. Oberyn even shared a recipe for cooking horse meat recently. Actually, I should go inform the kitchens we can try it tonight." He laughed. Willis handed the letter back to Marjorie. "As for our Pioneer Knight's request, it's up to you to decide whether to continue supporting him. If you need more funds, let me know." Marjorie couldn't tell if her brother's acceptance was genuine or feigned but chose not to press the issue. She sighed as she took back the letter. "I suppose we have to keep funding him, we can't have him slinking back here so soon." "All right. How much do you need?" 500, no, 300 gold dragons. This time, I'll make sure to tell that glutton to spend more carefully. Dash. Careful with money? Do I look like I'm short on cash? Samwell's boastful words left Gavin looking concerned. "But, my lord, the funds you gave me for supplies are nearly gone." "So quickly?" Samwell looked surprised but remained calm. Seeing this, Gavin felt slightly reassured, though he still tried to reason with his lord. "My lord, you don't really have to be this generous with us. Although you promised a meat ration, we'd be fine with just meat broth. Right now, you're giving us 20 pounds of meat every day. That's a bit extravagant. How will the men have the strength to train without a hearty meal?" Samwell countered. "And don't worry about the money, I'm not short on cash." Gavin sighed, but he couldn't deny the warmth in his heart. "My lord, you're the most generous knight I've ever known." Completely at ease with this praise, Samwell handed Gavin more gold dragons. "All right, go to the village and stock up on supplies. See if there's anything we haven't bought before. No matter the price, bring it back." "Yes, my lord." Samwell's lavish spending was no bluff. Although his funds were indeed running low, he was confident House Tyrell wouldn't let him fail. After all, they'd already invested 100 elite soldiers, surely they'd be willing to spend a bit more gold. Samwell knew that while Lady Olenna had her motives, mutual benefits were a part of any alliance. Until she achieved her aims, he held the advantage. After Gavin left, Samwell walked to the front of the camp and ordered. "All right, today's drills begin." He blew the assembly horn. Within moments, the new recruits burst from their tents, lining up in perfect rows. In truth, Samwell was far from confident in his training methods. The only experience he had with military drills was from his college ROTC days in his past life. The original Samwell had indeed been forced into military education by his father, but those memories felt foreign, like seashells scattered on a beach. He had to painstakingly gather and piece them together. Since deciding to undertake this expedition, Samwell had been reviewing the original Samwell's knowledge of military tactics, blending it with fragments of modern military theory he'd picked up from books, movies, and shows. Combined with his management experience from his previous life, he'd been developing a training system that was gradually taking shape. As for its effectiveness, Samwell wasn't sure yet, he'd need a real battle to see. But at least now, the recruits could understand basic commands and perform simple formations and combat moves. Gone were the days of disorder. Now they looked like actual soldiers. What Samwell didn't realize was that his training methods were unsettling Sir Todd Flowers, who watched from a distance. When Samwell first announced his plan to recruit dock workers, Todd had fully expected it to be a disaster. He thought Samwell, the infamous wastrel of the Reach, would lose all his new recruits long before reaching the frontier. But things had turned out very differently. Not only had none of the recruits deserted, but they were now surprisingly disciplined. After only a month, they looked so well trained that no one would doubt they were regular soldiers. Todd's initial disdain had turned to serious attention, and he now watched Samwell's training sessions closely. The unusual methods filled him with both shock and a hint of fear. Could this really be the same worthless son of House Tarly? If Lord Randall rejected such a son, just how incredible must the heir he chose be? Todd noticed that Samwell had been awkward at first, but he'd grown increasingly skilled and confident, with the recruits' appearance and morale visibly transforming. Of course, Todd knew these recruits were still inexperienced, nowhere near the level of regular soldiers. But the fact that Samwell had achieved even this in a single month was impressive. Todd doubted he could have done the same. It's just because they're eating meat every day that they have so much energy, Todd's squire, Carter, muttered jealously. Chapter 8, Ghost Grass. With enough meat in a month's time, could you train 100 dock workers to this level? Faced with Todd's question, Carter hesitated, unable to give a confident answer. He had experience training newly conscripted soldiers and knew how challenging it could be. After a moment, however, Carter stiffened his neck and replied. So what? They're still weak. Give me 6 or 7 men, and we could break this group of recruits with a single charge. Todd didn't bother to respond. He clearly remembered how, when Samwell first recruited these men, Carter had sneered, claiming he could scatter all 100 of them by himself. Now, just a month later, he needed 6 or 7 others to help him. Todd wondered how many regular soldiers Carter would need to feel confident about breaking through this group once they reached the Red Mountains. To be honest, Todd wanted to ask Samwell about his training methods but feared it might be a Tarly family secret. For now, he had to settle for quietly observing from the sidelines. And while he was observing, Todd noticed something else. Samwell's own physical abilities seemed to be improving at an astonishing rate. When they left Highgarden, Samwell had been a hefty man who struggled to mount a horse. But after a month, though still large, he no longer seemed as sluggish. In the beginning, Samwell had mostly directed the training sessions, occasionally participating, only to tire quickly. But now, he was able to complete the entire routine alongside his recruits, a shocking rate of improvement. This only reinforced Todd's belief that Samwell's worthless reputation was an act, the result of deliberately gaining weight and now going through a recovery routine to shed it. That would explain his rapid progress. With that thought, Todd's expression grew even darker. The training continued until midday, following Samwell's marching routine, a system he'd established since their departure. The mornings were dedicated to training, followed by lunch and a 2-hour rest, then a leisurely departure, setting up camp by nightfall. After a hearty meal, the troops would also engage in night drills. As a result, after a month, they had completed barely half of the journey. Todd had suggested several times that they speed up their march, but Samwell refused each time. The cautious pioneer knight insisted that he wouldn't venture into the Red Mountains until these new recruits were trained to be proper soldiers. I think he's just stalling so he doesn't have to go on this expedition, Carter grumbled to Todd. Once he runs out of money, he'll have an excuse to give up and return home. What a cowardly Tarly wastrel. Todd remained silent. Encouraged by this, Carter added, Sir Todd, are you really just going to watch him do this? Todd snapped back, and what would you have me do? Hold a sword to his throat and force him. Carter lowered his voice. Not exactly, but maybe we could scare him a little to keep him on track. Todd turned, squinting at his squire. Carter coughed and clarified. I mean, maybe a little scare would help him stay focused. Todd looked away, saying nothing. Dash. The scent of cooking meat filled the air as smoke rose from the campfires. The recruits, exhausted from training, sat cross-legged on the ground, faces full of contentment. After all, they were eating meat every day, what's not to be happy about? Over the past month, this journey had felt almost unreal to the new recruits. They'd expected the hardships of an expedition, but instead, this had become the happiest period of their lives. The training was grueling, of course, but they were former dock workers used to hard labor. And with daily meat rations, no amount of effort felt too much. More and more, they felt that following Lord Caesar on this venture was the best decision they had ever made. What they didn't know was that their Lord Caesar was facing a dilemma. His concerns, however, weren't about money. Though his funds were indeed dwindling, Samwell was confident House Tyrell wouldn't let his expedition end prematurely. After all, they'd already sent 100 elite soldiers. Would they really hold back on a few more gold dragons? Samwell's true worry lay with his attribute panel. Over a month of training had brought significant changes to his stats. Samwell Caesar. Title, Pioneer Knight. Land, none. Vassals, none. Strength, 1.22. Agility, 0.73. Spirit, 1.12. Both strength and agility had increased substantially, especially strength, thanks largely to his steady diet of golden tail shrimp. Of course, it hadn't been cheap. The rapid depletion of his funds was partly due to feeding his recruits meat daily, but also because he hadn't held back on his own diet. Golden tail shrimp was a constant. As long as he found it, he bought it, regardless of the price. In each town, he also sent Gavin to gather every unique food item he could find, hoping to discover something like the golden tail shrimp that could boost his stats. But so far, nothing. Samwell had tried everything from exotic delicacies to outright strange dishes, snails, lizards, even silkworm pupae, but nothing made a difference. Worse still, he noticed that once his strength reached 1.20, the golden tail shrimp's effect had halved. Yes, he remembered clearly that when he first ate a shrimp after reaching 1.20 strength, there was no response. Only after eating a second did his strength tick up to 1.21. The remaining 0.01 increase had taken him 3 grueling days of training to achieve. This shift frustrated him, and he suspected that as his strength continued to rise, the effect of the golden tail shrimp would decrease further. As for agility, while he hadn't found any foods to enhance it, it continued to rise at a good pace. This likely owed to its low starting point, which made gains easier. Also, the increase in strength might have contributed indirectly. After all, logically, more strength should lead to greater speed. With his recent weight loss, his movements had grown freer as well. But as agility continued to increase, Samwell expected it would eventually plateau, just like strength. As for spirit, it hadn't budged in over a month. But Samwell wasn't too concerned. After all, Daenerys's dragons hadn't hatched yet, and the mystical side of this world remained dormant. Even if he raised his spirit, it likely wouldn't have any immediate benefits. For now, raising strength and agility was more practical. With that in mind, Samwell mentally repeated, "I am an unstoppable eating machine," as he numbly shoved the assortment of strange foods Gavin had brought back into his mouth. With each odd taste flooding his senses, Samwell's face grew increasingly grim. But suddenly, his eyes lit up. "Gavin." "Yes, my lord." "What is this plant called?" Samwell held up a silver-white wild grass, his tone urgent. Because after eating it, his spirit had increased by 0.01. Though it wasn't the strength or agility he had hoped for, finding something that boosted his spirit was an opportunity he wouldn't pass up. "My lord, that's called ghost grass." Chapter 9, Threats. "My lord, aren't we leaving yet?" "Hold on, I sent Gavin to the market to buy something." "But didn't he just go there this morning?" "He didn't bring enough money earlier, so he has to go again." Samwell answered casually, still staring off in the direction Gavin had taken, waiting with anticipation. Todd sighed and turned away. Once he was facing away from Samwell, a cold glint flashed in the eyes of the Knight Squire. It was almost dusk when Gavin returned. "My lord, I searched the entire market but could only find 2 stalks of ghost grass. That damn merchant gouged me 20 silver stags." "As long as you found it, that's what matters." Samwell quickly took the ghost grass from him, unconcerned with the price. "Did you ask where it's grown?" "Yes, sir, I did. The merchant said ghost grass only grows in the Red Mountains and is pretty rare, hard to come by. He got these from an adventurer, and I managed to find the man. He said he took the grass from a wildling of the Crow tribe he'd killed." "The Red Mountains, the Crow tribe?" Samwell repeated, suppressing the surge of desire building within him. He mounted his horse and gave the order, "Move out." The camp was silent, blanketed by night. As Samwell lay asleep, he felt a sudden chill on his face and jolted awake. When he opened his eyes, he saw a shadowy figure standing inside his tent. "Shhh. Lord Caesar, if you don't want this sword to accidentally cut your throat, don't make a sound." Samwell took a few deep breaths, forcing himself to calm down. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he recognized the face before him. It was Todd's squire, Carter. "Carter, what do you think you're doing?" Carter chuckled. "Lord Caesar, I just have a small matter to discuss with you." "Speak, then." "Our marching speed is too slow. At this rate, who knows when we'll reach the Red Mountains. Starting tomorrow, I hope you'll stop wasting time training these useless recruits and push on to the Red Mountains. Once we're there, you don't need to worry about wildlings or beasts, we'll keep you safe." Samwell's face darkened. "Did Todd Flowers send you?" Carter didn't answer but tapped Samwell's face with the flat of his blade. "Lord Caesar, do you agree with my suggestion or not?" Samwell's tone turned icy. "You know the penalty for a commoner threatening a noble with a sword, don't you?" "A noble? Hat. All I know is that you're a wastrel abandoned by your family. Yet I still bear noble blood and was knighted by Duke Mace himself. Would you dare kill me?" "Sir, have you forgotten? We're not in a castle right now, we're out here, far from any law. If I kill you and claim a wildling attack, do you think House Tarly would even investigate? Samwell fell silent. After a moment, as if defeated, he spoke in a low voice. Fine. There will be no more training. We'll march at full speed from tomorrow. That's more like it. Carter withdrew his sword, smirking. Over these past days, I've come to realize that you're not as foolish as the rumors say. So you should know that we're your only real protection here. As for those recruits, if they tried to resist, they wouldn't survive a single charge. So do as you're told, and things will go smoothly between us. Samwell kept his head down, his face unreadable in the darkness. Carter didn't seem to care. He gave a mock bow and said, "Good night, Sir Caesar." With that, he left the tent. Samwell sat in silence, unable to sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Samwell indeed called off the drills, ordering the group to march south at full speed. The recruits seemed puzzled but didn't question his orders. On the third day, they continued in the same manner. For 3 days, they moved quickly and had already reached the upper reaches of the Meadwater River. On the fourth night, most of the camp was asleep. Carter was on watch, accompanied by 3 other guards. "My lord, at this pace, we should reach the Red Mountains soon, right?" one of them asked. "Yeah, another 2 or 3 weeks." Carter sat on a large rock at the edge of the camp, chewing on a blade of wild grass. "If it weren't for that cowardly fat knight wasting so much time, we'd already be fishing on the summer sea. Why did that fat knight suddenly stop training the recruits? Does he think a month was enough?" one of the men asked, seemingly oblivious to the true reason for the change in pace. Carter sneered, keeping the real reason to himself. He wasn't foolish enough to share that he'd threatened a noble with a sword. "What does it matter? If we get there..." He stopped mid-sentence. His face grew serious. "Did you hear that? It sounds like something moving in the trees." "Yes, I heard it too. Let's check it out." Carter stood and led the way into the trees, heading toward the noise. After a short distance, Carter stopped and said to one of his men, "Jamie, go back alone. If we're not back in 10 minutes, wake Sir Todd." "Yes, my lord." With that, Carter continued on with the remaining 2 men. After a while, he stopped again, looking around warily. "Hold up. I think someone's trying to lure us deeper." "My lord, should we go back and wake Sir Todd?" "No need. It's probably just some bandits who didn't dare attack with so many of us. Let's go back and keep watch." He didn't finish, because just then, something darted through the underbrush nearby. Carter was quick. He threw his sword at the shape. Whoosh! "Got it." Carter clapped his hands, relaxing. "Looks like it was just a rabbit." He walked over to retrieve his sword and his prize. But after only a few steps, he felt a sudden, strong pull on his right leg. Swish! Before his men could react, they turned to see their leader hanging upside down from a tree. Startled, they drew their swords, just as a dozen figures emerged from the darkness, surveilling them. Struggling against the rope, Carter yelled, "You fools! Cut me down!" Before they could move, a voice came from the shadows. "Drop your weapons, or you'll die." Samwell Caesar. Carter recognized the voice instantly. "What do you think you're doing?" Samwell approached, smiling as he stopped in front of Carter. "Oh, just wanted to ask you a question." "What question?" "It's the same one I asked 4 days ago." Samwell grabbed Carter by the hair and pressed his sword to the man's throat. "What's the penalty for a commoner who threatens a noble with a sword?" Feeling the cold blade at his throat, Carter's bravado vanished. "My lord! I was only joking." "A joke? The kingdom's laws aren't a joke." Seeing the murderous glint in Samwell's eyes, Carter began to panic. At that moment, a voice called out from a distance. "Lord Caesar! Please, show mercy! Sir Todd!" Carter shouted in relief, "Save me! Sir Todd Flowers!" Samwell greeted the approaching figure warmly, as if greeting an old friend. But at the same moment, he pulled his sword sharply down. Slice! The cold blade slashed across Carter's throat without mercy. Chapter 10, Intimidation. The forest went silent. The sound of Carter's labored breaths became disturbingly clear. It was like someone trying to drain the ocean with a straw. Soon, his desperate struggles stopped, ending in despair, leaving only the sound of blood dripping to the ground. Then, Todd's furious voice rang out. "Lord Caesar, do you understand what you've done?" Seeing Todd's aggression, Gavin and the others rushed forward, ready to block him. Samwell realized that now, of all times, he couldn't show any weakness. So instead of backing down, he took a step forward and yelled. "Todd Flowers! What's do want to do? Do you actually dare to draw your sword on me?" Todd's half-drawn sword immediately halted. Seeing this, Samwell stepped closer, demanding. "Do you honestly not know what Carter has done?" Todd's mouth opened as if to respond, but before he could say anything, Samwell took another step forward. "Do you truly not understand why I killed Carter? Do you dare swear by the 7 gods that you had no knowledge of his actions?" With Samwell's relentless questioning, Todd's initial momentum faltered, and his sword seemed stuck, unable to leave its sheath. Seeing Todd hesitate, Samwell breathed a quiet sigh of relief. The most dangerous moment had passed. Todd's hesitation meant his sword would now stay sheathed. As he relaxed, Samwell noticed his own pounding heartbeat and the queasiness in his stomach. He hid his trembling hands behind his back, struggling to maintain his composure. Despite the risk, Carter had to die. Otherwise, Samwell would lose control over the expedition and, more importantly, over his own life. He couldn't allow that. Todd, now calm but still looking at Carter's lifeless, hanging body, felt an uncontrollable anger and a twinge of fear he didn't want to admit. After spending over a month with him, Todd knew that Samwell, the so-called useless son of House Tarly, was anything but worthless. But he hadn't expected Samwell to be so ruthless and decisive. Todd took a deep breath, released his grip on the sword, and said in a heavy tone. "Lord Caesar, even if Carter was in the wrong, killing him was a mistake. It'll anger my soldiers, and in their anger, they might refuse to genuinely help you with the settlement. Some of them might even cause trouble for you. Remember, we're out here in the wilderness, not safe within castle walls." Samwell replied nonchalantly. "That's easy enough to handle. Just tell them that Carter was caught in a bandit's trap and died. Problem solved." Todd scoffed. "My lord, as a knight, you should know that honesty is a virtue." "Oh, is that so?" Samwell's lips curled in a smirk. "Then tell me, honest Sir Todd, why did Lady Olenna send you to accompany me on this mission?" Todd hesitated, falling silent. Samwell went on, still smiling. "Actually, you don't need to tell me. I think I already know." Todd glanced at him with a skeptical look. Samwell leaned closer to Todd's ear and whispered one word. "Pirates." Watching Todd's eyes widen and his breathing quicken, Samwell knew he'd struck a nerve. "Want to know how I figured it out?" Todd stared intently at Samwell, a mix of curiosity and alarm in his expression. "I'm guessing you're a bastard of House Redwine." "Yes," Todd replied. "My father is Sir Desmond." This wasn't particularly well hidden, and it wasn't hard to deduce. After all, Lady Olenna, known as the Queen of Thorns, hailed from House Redwine of the Arbor. Sending a family bastard along on Samwell's expedition made sense. Samwell grinned. "When Lady Olenna first asked me to settle this land, I had a question: how would this new territory support itself?" Todd seemed to start to understand. Samwell continued. "This area around the Red Mountains is barren, unfit for farming or livestock, and, unlike Casterly Rock, there's no gold mine beneath it. So, what would support the people of this new territory? Lady Olenna claimed the sea offered trade opportunities." "Ha! She must have thought I was a fool. Trade with what? Rocks." It didn't take long to notice that this territory lies right at the mouth of the Torrentine River. Upstream from here are 3 Dornish holdings: Starfall, High Hermitage, and Blackmont. And it's near the southern end of the Redwine Strait, right along one of Dorne's busiest trade routes. With Dornish ships constantly traveling these waters and rivers, it wasn't hard to deduce Lady Olenna's plan, don't you think?" By now, Todd's face showed unmistakable alarm. Samwell continued, "Moreover, I guessed you were from House Redwine on the Arbor, and that house is known for its warships and sailors. I imagine that's one of the main reasons Lady Olenna sent you along with me. And the beauty of it is, if the plan were exposed, I, the Lord of the territory, would bear the blame, while House Tyrell and House Redwine would remain untarnished. Clever, isn't it?" Todd looked down, seemingly unable to meet Samwell's penetrating gaze. Samwell sighed, patting Todd's shoulder, and leaned close once more. But have you considered? If this scheme were ever revealed, as the knight accompanying me, you'd be implicated too. Even if you weren't executed, would you come out of it with a good reputation? Todd stayed silent. Samwell's tone grew more sincere. You're a disregarded bastard, I'm a discarded heir. We're kindred spirits. Lady Olenna's plan risks both our reputations and futures. Tell me, are you content to be her puppet? Todd finally raised his head, giving a cold, bitter laugh. Do we even have a choice? If I don't take risks, how will I rise? And do you truly think you can finish this without Tyrell's support? Which is exactly why we should work together. Samwell tried to put an arm around Todd's shoulders, but Todd stepped aside. Todd responded coolly, we're already working together on settling this territory. You know that's not what I meant. I do. But we have no choice, Todd said, with a flicker of resignation. As you said yourself, this land is barren. Besides doing as Lady Olenna intends, what other path is there? There is one. Todd's head shot up, and he stared at Samwell with intensity. What other path? A legitimate, lawful one. Samwell gave him a mysterious smile. If you're interested, swear loyalty to me first. Todd scoffed, staying where he was. Samwell shrugged, unfazed. He hadn't expected Todd to pledge loyalty so readily. After all, Samwell was only a landless knight and had little leverage to command allegiance from a bastard of the Arbor. His words and the decision to kill Carter were aimed less at Todd than at Lady Olenna. Seeing Todd's lack of reaction didn't make Samwell falter. Instead, he smiled and said, think about it. Do you want to risk your reputation and future on shady dealings, or join me in making honest money? With that, Samwell led his men back to camp. Todd stayed behind, lost in thought. Chapter 11, Equipment. Carter's death did not cause much of a stir. As Samwell had suggested, Todd announced that Carter had been killed by passing bandits. When the Tyrell soldiers heard this, they immediately clamored to avenge Carter. Left with no other choice, Todd led a group to patrol the nearby area. They managed to catch a few bandits wandering in the vicinity. Fueled by righteous anger, the soldiers used these hapless bandits as scapegoats, executing them and offering their heads in tribute to Carter. Well, at least they were helping rid the area of outlaws. Meanwhile, Samwell resumed the new recruits' military training. The pace of the expedition slowed back down to its original, steady crawl. That afternoon, as Samwell finished training and was roasting a leg of venison by the campfire, he noticed a lone rider approaching on the road in the distance. The rider, upon spotting their group, turned his horse and headed in their direction. Gavin immediately took a few men to greet the newcomer. After a brief interrogation, they found that he was a messenger from Highgarden, bringing a letter from Marjorie, along with a bag full of gold dragons. Delighted, Samwell instructed Gavin to treat the messenger well, while he himself opened Marjorie's letter. The scented ink on the parchment gave off a faint, delicate fragrance, but the message itself was less than gentle. Marjorie had sharply expressed her dissatisfaction with Samwell's excessive spending and requested that he immediately increase the pace of their journey. Samwell ignored that part of her request. However, when he laid his hands on the bag of gold dragons, he sincerely offered his gratitude to the faraway lady of Highgarden. Then he began to ponder what new excuse he could use the next time he needed to ask her for more funds. At that moment, they heard another commotion on the road near the camp. This time, it was a much larger caravan, around 100 people and several dozen wagons. Gavin took a few men to investigate, then returned with a report. "Milord, it's a caravan from Old Town, headed to the city of Highgarden." Samwell nodded, recognizing the banner on the caravan, a white stepped tower topped with a beacon on an ash-grey background. It was the sigil of House Hightower, the ruling family of Old Town. Samwell hadn't planned on paying any mind to the caravan, but he suddenly remembered something and changed his mind, instructing Gavin. "Announce my title and ask the caravan steward to come over." "Yes, milord." Not long after, a short, middle-aged man approached, following Gavin at a brisk pace. "Noble Sir Caesar, I am Jess, steward of House Hightower's caravan. Please allow me to offer Lord Leighton's greetings on his behalf." "Mr. Jess, what are you transporting?" "We're delivering a shipment of weapons and armor for sale in Highgarden." "Weapons and armor? May I take a look?" "Of course." Jess led Samwell into the caravan and showed him the various pieces of weaponry and armor, long swords, steel knives, bows, spears, and armor. Samwell's eyes lit up when he saw a wagon filled with leather armor, and he picked up a piece to examine it closely. Seeing Samwell's interest, Jess smiled and began to promote the items. "My lord, this armor is made from grey lizard hide. It's durable and comfortable. Would you like to try it on?" Samwell declined to wear it himself but called Gavin over to try it on instead. Seeing Samwell's clear interest, Jess pressed his advantage. "My lord, if you're satisfied, I can send word back to Old Town to have the leather workers make an entire batch for you at a fair price." Samwell stroked his chin, non-committal, and then asked, "Do you have any other types of armor?" "Yes, we have a few chainmail suits. Would you like to see them?" "What about plate armor?" Jess gave a rueful smile and shook his head. "Apologies, my lord. Plate armor takes a long time to craft and is quite costly. Even the best smithies in Old Town only produce 3 or 4 suits a year, and they're usually spoken for before they're even finished." Samwell wasn't surprised by this. Plate armor, as the best protective gear in this era, was incredibly difficult to make and expensive. For many lesser lords, a well-crafted suit of plate armor could be a treasured family heirloom, passed down for generations. Even if Jess's caravan had some, Samwell doubted he could afford it. As the disinherited eldest son, Lord Randall Tarley certainly hadn't provided Samwell with armor. When he left Highgarden, Samwell had decided not to buy armor since he'd be spending a lot on recruitment, and he was slimming down anyway, so his size would soon change. Now, with the fresh gold he'd just persuaded out of the rows of Highgarden, Samwell couldn't resist the urge to upgrade his own armor and get some for his new recruits as well. Good armor, after all, made a tremendous difference on the battlefield. "Show me the chainmail, then." "Certainly, my lord, this way." Jess guided Samwell to another wagon and pulled out a chainmail shirt. "This one's just about the right size for you, would you like to try it on?" "Sure." Jess cheerfully helped Samwell put on the chainmail while explaining. "My lord, this was crafted by the best smith in Old Town. It took him 3 months to link over 1,000 rings together. It weighs about 35 pounds and will effectively protect against swords, spears, and arrows. What do you think?" Samwell moved his arms and legs in the chainmail and found it satisfactory. He then asked, "If I take this chainmail and order an additional 108 suits of that leather armor, how much would that cost?" Jess's eyes brightened, clearly pleased with such a large order. He quickly replied, "My lord, that would come to 735 gold dragons in total. If you decide to go ahead, I'll immediately send word back to Old Town." Samwell raised a hand to stop him. "The price is fine, but I need the goods now. Immediately." "This?" Jess hesitated. "But, my lord, these items were reserved for House Mullendor of Highgarden." Samwell shrugged. "I understand. However, we're bound for the Red Mountains to settle land, and we urgently need this equipment. If I can't get it here, I'll have to look elsewhere." Jess paused to think it over. Since House Mullendor was a vassal of his own lord's house, the delivery schedule was flexible. Making a decision, he said, "All right. My lord, I'll prioritize your order and give you this shipment. I'll arrange for a replacement to be sent to House Mullendor." "That's the spirit," Samwell said, grinning widely as he counted out the recently acquired gold dragons, along with a portion of the funds his father had given him, and handed them to Jess. He then instructed Gavin to distribute the leather armor to the new recruits. Gavin was overjoyed as he held the armor but couldn't help adding, a little mournfully, "My lord, you're far too generous with us. But, spending like this, I fear." "Nothing to worry about." Samwell waved off his concerns with a grand gesture. "Didn't I tell you? Money is no object." Chapter 12, Secrets. Dear Miss Marjorie, I apologize for troubling you again, but I have to admit, I'm out of funds once more. This time, I assure you it wasn't due to frivolous spending. I'm sure you're aware that I am not my father's favored son. He provided me with nothing but a sword and a warhorse. Aside from that, I have nothing of value. With the Red Mountains looming ahead, I felt it necessary to acquire better equipment to handle any battles we may face. As a knight, after all, I can hardly face the world without a suit of armor. Without it, people might even think House Tyrell is stingy with its vassals. Fortunately, near Highgarden, we came across a high-tower merchant caravan that happened to have what I needed, so I spent what was necessary. And of course, recalling your last advice, I refrained from purchasing a more costly suit of plate armor and opted for a more economical chainmail instead. Additionally, I purchased leather armor for each of my new soldiers. I know you may feel this decision was excessive, but these brave men have journeyed great distances to follow me into the Red Mountains. I couldn't possibly send them into battle so poorly equipped. I trust that someone as beautiful and kind-hearted as you, Miss Marjorie, would certainly understand my reasoning. Humph. The beautiful and kind-hearted Marjorie crumpled the letter in her hands, her teeth gritting with annoyance. But a moment later, she softened, a smile breaking out as if she suddenly recalled something amusing. What is it? Lady Olenna asked, watching her granddaughter shift from anger to laughter with curiosity. It's that Samwell again. He actually sent another letter asking me for money. Then give it to him. Marjorie's eyes went wide at Olenna's casual reply. But, grandmother, this is the second time he's asked. I think he's spending it on purpose. If we send him more, he'll probably burn through it just as quickly. Are we short on funds? Olenna interrupted with a smile. Marjorie shook her head but remained indignant. True, but that doesn't mean he can simply take advantage. I feel like he's extorting us. Then refuse him and instruct Todder to bring our soldiers back. What? Marjorie's anger faltered, and she hesitated. But, if we do that, will Samwell still be able to carry out his mission? Besides, didn't you say you wanted to use him to deal with Dorne? It would be a shame to give up so soon. Olenna chuckled, now you see why he's been so bold in his demands. Marjorie sighed, sidling up to Olenna and hugging her arm. Grandmother, please teach me what should I do in a situation like this. Lady Olenna lovingly patted her granddaughter's hand and, instead of answering directly, asked, what's your impression of Samwell Tarly? He's different from the rumors, I think, except for being quite fat, of course. They say he's cowardly, but I think he's surprisingly bold. He dares to extort from House Tyrell. Oh, he's more than just bold enough to extort, he even had Todder Flower's attendant killed. What? Marjorie exclaimed. That's right, Lady Olenna explained. I just received a letter from Todder himself, informing me that Samwell killed Carter on the grounds of threatening a noble with a sword. He dared to kill Carter? And Todder didn't intervene? Isn't he afraid that the soldiers will resent him? Olenna took a letter from her sleeve and handed it to Marjorie. Here's Todder's account, read it for yourself. As Marjorie scanned the letter, her surprise deepened. This man is quite cunning, and decisively so. I suppose the rumors weren't very accurate after all. Olenna's gaze turned pensive. What surprised me the most was Samwell's knack for training soldiers. Yes. In just a little over a month, he's managed to turn dock workers into disciplined soldiers. It's almost unbelievable. Randyll Tarly certainly trained him well. Olenna mused, though a slight frown tugged at her brow. Bold, decisive, shrewd, and skilled in military matters, Samwell has all the qualities of a worthy heir. So why would Randyll be so dissatisfied with such a son that he's set on stripping him of his inheritance? Maybe he just thinks Samwell is too fat. Your father is quite the inflated fish, yet it hasn't stopped him from becoming the Lord of Highgarden. That's different, Marjorie said, though a bit awkwardly as her grandmother's barb landed close to home. House Tarly's motto is first in battle, so perhaps Lord Randyll simply insists on an heir who can lead from the front lines. Ah! So you think Randyll is just a brute with no brains? Of course not. Lord Randyll is one of the finest generals in the Reach, hardly a man without brains. It's just that he seems to prefer the battlefield to scheming in the shadows. You still think of Randyll as nothing but a brute? Olenna didn't hold back as she punctured her granddaughter's polite phrasing. Randyll not a schemer? Please. During Robert's rebellion, Robert Baratheon rose up against the Targaryens, winning battle after battle and claiming 3 victories in a single day at Summerhall. But then he ran into Randyll Tarly at Ashford and suffered a crushing defeat, forced to flee north. Afterward, the Reach army advanced into the Stormlands, laying siege to Storm's End. Do you recall how long that siege lasted? I believe it was over a year. Yes, over a year. And yet they still failed to capture it. Olenna observed her granddaughter's widening brown eyes with a smile. And do you remember what ultimately allowed the Stormlanders to break the siege? Yes, Marjorie said slowly. It was Davos Seaworth who broke the blockade by smuggling a shipload of onions into Storm's End, alleviating the city's food crisis just in time for Lord Eddard's arrival. That's why Stannis knighted him as the Onion Knight. Olenna's expression turned sardonic. Have you ever wondered how Davos managed to slip his ship past the blockade? At the time, 200 ships from the High Tower fleet were blocking every approach to Storm's End's port. Could Davos' little ship fly? Marjorie's brows knit together, realization dawning. Lady Olenna continued, her tone secretive, let me share a little secret. During the siege, Randyll Tarly once wrote to me, stating that Storm's End had run out of food. Marjorie blinked, surprised. Her grandmother hadn't been present on the battlefield, so why would Randyll bother to send such a message to her, far away in Highgarden? But, recalling the Onion Knight's exploits, she began to understand. Seeing her reaction, Olenna's expression softened, and she gave a pleased smile. Exactly. After receiving Randyll's letter, I sent one of my own to Pakester Redwine. Chapter 13, A Change in Strategy. Of course, Marjorie understood who her grandmother meant by Pakester Redwine, Lord of the Arbor, who had commanded the fleet blockading Storm's End at the time. Now fully understanding, Marjorie said, so that's why the Onion Knight Davos Seaworth managed to slip his smuggler's ship into Storm's End. It was Lord Pakester's doing, wasn't it? Exactly. Lady Olenna confirmed her granddaughter's guess. After a prolonged siege at Storm's End, Randyll Tarly actually advised your father to leave a smaller contingent behind to maintain the siege while leading the Reach's main forces north to join the royal army against the rebels. But our foolish fat flower seemed either too confident in the royal army's chances or too hesitant to risk his forces facing the rebels head-on. Instead, he remained obsessed with Storm's End, clashing endlessly with that damned fortress. Then, before long, word came that Prince Rhaegar had fallen to Robert's hammer at the Trident, and the entire war turned. And even then, your father refused to see reason, still pouring resources into the siege of Storm's End. Randyll, as a last resort, wrote that seemingly inconsequential letter to me. If not for that letter, Robert's 2 brothers would have starved within Storm's End's walls. And tell me, if they had perished, do you think Robert Baratheon, having overthrown House Targaryen, would have accepted the Reach's noble houses as easily, considering our former loyalty to the king? Marjorie nodded thoughtfully. So, Randyll Tarly didn't want to push things too far, he wanted to leave room for negotiation. Exactly. Every noble house in the Reach should thank Randyll Tarly, for he was the one person who stayed clear-headed throughout the war. And you understand now why Randyll didn't directly approach Pakester but wrote to me instead, correct? Marjorie nodded. She understood that Randyll had wanted to be cautious and avoid any incriminating signs of colluding with the rebels. He trusted Lady Olenna to understand his intent and to see the bigger picture. Besides, as Pakester Redwine's aunt and mother-in-law, Olenna's advice would be more effective and safer. Now, do you still think Randyll Tarly is a brute without wits? Marjorie stuck out her tongue playfully. I didn't expect such a hidden story behind the siege of Storm's End. Now, I see that Randyll Tarly indeed has a sharp political mind. Lady Olenna sighed. You should be grateful that Hornhill is not a rich domain, nor does House Tarly have enough influence within the Reach. Otherwise, I would have advised your father to get rid of him long ago. Marjorie felt a shiver at the glint in her grandmother's eyes. But Lady Olenna quickly returned to her usual gentle, doting demeanor as if the prior comment had been mere jest. Once composed, Marjorie asked, Grandmother, if that's so, why doesn't Lord Randyll see the potential in Samwell? Why strip him of his inheritance? That's the part I can't quite grasp. Perhaps being cast out finally pushed Samwell to his senses, causing him to change his ways. Seeing her grandmother perplexed was a rare sight, and Marjorie couldn't help but feel amused. But once she stifled her laughter, she pointed at the letter in her hand. Grandmother, you still haven't told me how to deal with Samwell's demands for money. Should I keep sending him funds? Why not? Besides our roses, House Tyrell has money in abundance, Lady Olenna answered with a chuckle. Such a promising young man, neglected by his father, it only makes sense we bring him to our side. Marjorie looked hesitant, recalling the incident with Carter. But aren't you worried that Samwell will slip out of our control? Lady Olenna laughed. He's a landless hedge knight, even if he jumps up and down, he can't escape our grasp. Plus, managing vassals and encouraging them to fight for our cause is an art. Since Samwell is your knight by oath, you might as well use this opportunity to hone your skills. I don't have the right to knight anyone, it was done on behalf of my father. Marjorie stammered modestly before continuing in a softer tone, but grandmother, if Samwell succeeds with this latest scheme, what if he asks for more? Surely I can't just keep funding him indefinitely. That's why you need to set rules, don't let him lead you by the nose. What kind of rules? A simple way is to give him a set amount each month, regardless of his requests. Or, you could link rewards to his progress, offering more funds if he reaches certain milestones and withholding money if he falls behind. The important thing is to keep control. Don't just react every time he writes to ask for funds. I understand. Marjorie nodded thoughtfully. But grandmother, what exactly was your original plan for Samwell? At first, I assumed Samwell was a timid fool, so I thought a firm hand would keep him in line. Now it's clear that won't work. But don't worry. Just as flowers grow toward sunlight, people gravitate toward their interests. As long as you keep hold of that string, you can control anyone, especially someone like Samwell, who is both clever and ambitious. Marjorie's eyes sparkled with excitement, though she looked a bit nervous. Grandmother, you wanted him to settle in that specific place for some reason. I assumed it was related to Dorne, but I haven't figured out the full picture yet. I'm a bit worried I'll mess up your plan. How to handle Dorne isn't clear to you yet. Marjorie shook her head. Lady Olenna coaxed her gently. Then consider this, how did the Iron Throne bring Dorne under its influence? Through marriage alliances. Marriage was only the end result, not the reason. If marriage alone could conquer nations, what would we need armies for? Without Doran I's assault on Sun's pair that crushed the Dornish dream of independence, do you think House Martell would have willingly married off Princess Myraya to King's Landing? Consider carefully, when Aegon the Conqueror couldn't subdue Dorne with his dragons, how did Doran I manage to do it without them? Marjorie thought deeply before answering uncertainly, rivers. Exactly. The Red Mountains form a natural barrier, making Dorne nearly impossible to conquer by land alone. But rivers? They are the key to Dorne. Marjorie nodded in understanding but still looked curious. So that's why you suggested that Samwell establish his settlement at the mouth of the Torrentine River. But, grandmother, what exactly should he do there? Be patient, my dear. A skilled gardener understands that patience is essential. Once a seed is planted in the right place, all that remains is watering, and care time will bring the results. Besides, Olenna added with a smile, Todder tells me that Samwell claims he can conduct legitimate business in that barren area. I'm quite curious to see what surprises he has in store. Chapter 14, Upland's Castle. After crossing a tributary of the Honeywine River, Samwell and his men finally came upon a towering greystone castle. Moss and ivy crawled up the castle's weather-worn walls, silently telling tales of the many storms this ancient fortress had endured. Flying atop the castle's 100-foot tower was a white flag adorned with fluttering black and orange butterflies. This was the sigil of House Mullendor, Lords of Upland's Castle. Traveling southwest from here would soon lead them to the Red Mountains. If Samwell managed to establish a new fief in those mountains, House Mullendor would become his nearest neighbor. Hoping to secure a good relationship with his future neighbors, Samwell didn't bypass the castle. Instead, he dispatched Gavin to deliver a formal request for an audience with the Mullendors. Samwell Caesar, Lord Martin Mullendor said aloud, a bemused smile crossing his face as he held Samwell's letter in hand. This is the so-called Pioneer Knight, knighted by a woman. Gavin inclined his head slightly, his tone neither humble nor arrogant. My lord, Sir Caesar was knighted on behalf of Lord Mace Tyrell by his daughter, Lady Marjorie, and serves as an official vassal of House Tyrell. Lord Martin gave a disdainful snort. So yes, then, a knighted by a woman knight. Gavin kept his head lowered and didn't respond. Fine, Lord Martin sighed in lazy tones. Let him in. Gavin gave a short bow before turning and leaving. Lord Martin then addressed his steward. Have the kitchen prepare a dinner, but no need to go overboard. Just keep it respectable. Yes, my lord. Father, this is the Tarley family's wastrel son? Asked Lord Martin's eldest son, Mark Mullendor. Tall and broad-shouldered, Mark wore a full beard, and perched on his shoulder was a black and white monkey who was focused intently on cracking a nut. Exactly, Lord Martin replied. Randall Tarley is certainly a man to be reckoned with, yet he managed to produce a son like this. Now he's finally decided to strip Samwell of his inheritance, though I never would have expected him to exile him as a pioneer knight of all things. He may as well have sent him to the wall. Mark shrugged. If I had the choice, I'd take pioneering over the wall any day rather than be trapped in that god-forsaken place. Lord Martin cast his son a sideways glance and laughed. You think pioneering is easy, then? I know it's not easy, but the wall is clearly worse. Freezing cold, and I hear it's overrun with whites who can't be killed. Whites? Lord Martin chuckled. Nothing but children's tales. Thousands of years, and who's seen a white? And besides, it's summer, so the wall's hardly even cold right now. But winter's bound to come sooner or later. Who's to say? Lord Martin replied. This summer's been dragging on endlessly. It could last even longer yet. Only those godswood-worshipping northern savages would obsess about their winter is coming nonsense. Mark seemed to consider this before asking, Father, could this be the eternal summer the Seven promised, a world with no winter? The Seven said the eternal summer would arrive once all human sins were cleansed. Do you believe that day has come? Mark shook his head, resting his chin in his hand in thought. His shoulder monkey also began scratching its head, deep in monkey thought. Just then, a sound of marching boots echoed from outside the castle. Father! Come see! Mark called out. Lord Martin slowly walked to the balcony. What is it? Are you sure this Samwell is the disowned son? Mark asked in disbelief. Lord Martin was also taken aback. The sight of the 200 neatly arrayed, well-equipped soldiers below left him speechless. Samwell's 2 months of training had produced notable results. Those conscripted dock workers now moved with the disciplined bearing of veteran soldiers. In truth, of course, they'd yet to face the blood and fire of real combat, where their flaws would likely show. But with Samwell's investments in equipment and daily rations, these soldiers were more than enough to intimidate most onlookers. To Lord Martin, this so-called disowned wastrel had somehow assembled a 200-man force of what seemed to be elite troops. This was no minor armed escort. Upland's castle, after all, only maintained a standing force of just over 300. House Mullendore did have about a dozen vassal knights, and if necessary, Lord Martin could muster a force of up to 3,000 men, mainly farmers. He certainly wouldn't fear Samwell's force of 200. However, Lord Martin was a noble lord and the ruler of the uplands. Samwell, on the other hand, was merely a pioneering knight without even a plot of land. Even a victory would be beneath his dignity. Where in the Seven Hells did he find so many seasoned soldiers? Lord Martin growled, grinding his teeth. His initial contempt had quickly shifted into a strange mix of jealousy and resentment. After a moment's thought, Mark ventured, could Randyll Tarly have given them to him? Do you know how few regular troops House Tarly has? There's no way he'd spare so many soldiers for a disowned son. Mark scratched his head. He'd never visited the Tarly's lands, but he knew that House Tarly, while somewhat stronger than House Mullendore, couldn't afford to waste troops on a wastrel's pioneering expedition. Losing so many men in the Red Mountains would seriously weaken them. Maybe House Tyrell gave him these men. Only the wealth and resources of House Tyrell seemed sufficient to provide such a force to a wastrel like Samwell. Lord Martin rolled his eyes. Lord Pufffish wouldn't even knight him personally, and you think he'd hand him an army? Mark found this reasoning sound and scratched his head harder. His monkey began jumping and yanking on its fur, mirroring his frustration. Lord Martin stared down at the soldiers, his eyes hardening as he finally turned and headed for the stairs. Mark quickly followed. When father and son arrived at the castle gate, the steward and servants were already waiting with bread and salt. In Westeros, bread and salt signified the sacred law of guest right. Once a guest accepted a host's bread and salt, neither party could harm the other, as breaking this covenant was an offense to both the old gods and the new. Taking a small piece of bread, Samwell dipped it in salt and ate it. Then he placed his hand over his chest and bowed slightly to Lord Martin. My Lord Mullendore, thank you for your hospitality. With a warm smile, Lord Martin replied, Sir Caesar, welcome to Upland's Castle. Chapter 15, Persuasion, Part 1. Compared to the grandeur of Highgarden, the Mullendore family's castle was humble indeed. Heavy walls, small windows, and dim candlelight gave the banquet hall a cramped, even eerie feel. The dinner was far from luxurious, just roasted meat, sweet potatoes, mashed potatoes, and a simple vegetable salad. But Samwell, with no complaints, tucked in heartily, chatting with Mark about his charming monkey. Hearing that the monkey was from the Summer Isles, Samwell grew excited and began asking many questions such as the location of the Summer Isles, whether there were trading routes, and about the people, culture, and goods of the island. Mark, thrilled to find a fellow enthusiast of the Summer Isles, began sharing everything he knew, hardly pausing for breath. Watching his son quickly warm up to Samwell, Lord Martin Mullendore couldn't help but frown. Glancing over at Todd Flowers, who was quietly eating, he asked, Sir Todd, are you a knight of House Tyrell? Setting down his knife and fork, Todd replied, yes, my lord. The Viscount nodded thoughtfully, about to ask another question, when Samwell suddenly interjected, indeed, my lord. Sir Todd is a noble bastard from the Arbor, sent by Lady Olenna herself to lead Tyrell troops as I go to settle in the Red Mountains. Viscount Mullendore was secretly shocked, unaware that Samwell had deliberately blurred the lines between Tyrell's soldiers and the newly recruited men. To him, it now seemed that all 200 men in Samwell's retinue were Tyrell's elite soldiers. I never would have thought the Duke himself held you in such high regard, sending an army like this to accompany you, he remarked. Samwell chuckled, shaking his head. I'm afraid you're mistaken, my lord. Oh? How so? Well, the Duke has no reason to care about me. The real reason he sent soldiers is that he has his eyes on a new territory in the Red Mountains. I see. The Viscount clearly believed him. After all, he couldn't imagine this wastrel was important enough to warrant so many soldiers from Mace Tyrell. But then a new question arose: if Duke Mace valued the new land so much, why would he send someone like Samwell to establish it? Surely House Tyrell had no shortage of knights for the task. However, it would be rude to ask such a question outright, no matter how little Viscount Mullendore thought of Samwell. Yet, before he could even consider asking, Samwell unexpectedly offered, my lord, are you wondering why Duke Mace chose me? Smiling politely, Lord Mullendore flattered, the Tarleys have always produced fine soldiers. Perhaps the Duke is counting on your skills in leadership. This made everyone feel a little embarrassed. Even the black and white monkey screeched, waving its arms as if it couldn't handle the insincerity. Shaking his head, Samwell chuckled bitterly. I assure you, my lord, I have no such talents. Otherwise, my father wouldn't have driven me out and stripped me of my inheritance. The Duke chose me because I'm willing to do what others wouldn't dare. Oh? And what might that be? Asked the Viscount, intrigued. But Samwell merely smiled and glanced around the hall, clearly unwilling to speak further in front of others. Taking the hint, Lord Mullendore paused before setting down his fork, wiping his mouth with a napkin, and said to Samwell, I have some arbor wine in my collection. Would you care to sample some with me, see Samwell? It would be my pleasure. Samwell followed the Viscount out of the hall and into a smaller room. Lord Mullendore took a bottle from a shelf and poured 2 glasses, the crisp aroma of the wine quickly filling the space. Taking a glass, Samwell thanked him, savoring a sip of the cool, refreshing drink. But, of course, they hadn't come here to drink. My lord, Samwell began, I'll go straight to the point. The reason why Duke Mace would send me to the Red Mountains is because... Lord Mullendore swirled his glass, saying nothing, only waiting for Samwell to continue. Your city stands at the foot of the Red Mountains, so you surely know what awaits beyond barren lands, prowling beasts and wild tribes who raid at will. Even if one stakes a claim, survival, let alone prosperity, is nearly impossible. That's why most Reach Knights won't come here to settle. But I'm different. As an outcast, I have nothing to lose and would rather risk everything. He leaned in, whispering, and I have a clever trick to help my territory grow fast raiding. The Viscount chuckled at this, shaking his head. Sir Samwell, surely you're not thinking of raiding the wildlings, are you? I should warn you, the most valuable thing they have might be their poorly made leather garments. Samwell grinned, leaning forward. Oh, my lord, you misunderstand me. My new lands are on the northern shores of the Summer Sea, near the mouth of the Torrentine. Now, tell me, would I waste time raiding poor wildlings with so many wealthy merchant ships passing by? The Viscount narrowed his eyes at Samwell, studying him before finally replying, Sir Samwell, do I need to remind you of the Reach's laws on piracy? I'm quite aware, Samwell replied nonchalantly. But, my lord, have you forgotten that House Tyrell has sent over 200 of their best soldiers with me, led by someone from the Arbor? The Viscount's expression turned wary, tinged with disbelief. Indeed, Samwell continued, Lady Olenna has instructed me to raid Dornish ships only, never targeting others. Even so, if this comes to light, your name would be ruined, and you could even face the gallows. Samwell burst out laughing. My name? What name do I have left? And besides, without such actions, how could I establish anything in a place like the Red Mountains? The Viscount looked at Samwell thoughtfully. Sir Samwell, you're nothing like the rumors. Smiling, Samwell swirled his wine, rumors are deceiving, my lord. The Viscount returned the smile. In that case, I wish you success in your endeavour. Samwell suddenly leaned in closer. Now, Lord, what if I told you, that you, too, could profit from this endeavour? Lord Mullendore's gaze immediately turned guarded. Chapter 16, Enticement, Part 2. You can't possibly think I would risk tarnishing my family's honour by joining you in piracy, do you? Lord Mullendore's voice was sharp, his eyes narrowed. Of course not, Samwell replied, a harmless smile on his face. Such risk is best taken by a man in my desperate position. You would only need to invest, my lord. Should the venture be exposed one day, your name would remain unscathed. Invest? Mullendore asked, his tone wary. Exactly. Samwell took a sip of wine, adopting a casual tone. House Tyrell has already invested 200 elite soldiers, and soon House Redwine from the Arbor will supply ships and sailors. They all stand to gain a handsome return. So, my dear lord, would you wish to be part of this investment? After all, the Reach's two mightiest houses have already placed their bets. Opportunities like this do not come often. Lord Mullendore considered this but remained cautious. And what, pray tell, do you seek from me? Craftsman, Samwell said simply. I have troops, and I'll have ships soon enough, but I'm in dire need of skilled workers to help construct my holdfast and docks. That's why I would ask you to send Highgarden's finest craftsmen along on this journey. I can promise that in time, your rewards will be tenfold, perhaps even 100-fold. Lord Mullendore paused thoughtfully before finally nodding. Very well, I shall send 10 craftsmen to accompany you. 10. Samwell interrupted without hesitation, his tone laced with disappointment. Lord Mullendore, I tell you the truth of this venture, risking my own name and reputation to speak plainly, only for you to treat me as a mere beggar. Suppressing his irritation, Lord Mullendore asked, how many, then? All of them. Samwell replied smoothly. All of them. Yes, I want all of Highgarden's craftsmen, Samwell replied boldly, with a sweeping gesture. Let them work for me for 1 year, and at the end, I shall repay you with 10 times the wages. Out of the question. Lord Mullendore refused immediately. And if your venture fails? How then would I seek compensation? All my workers, lost to some fool's errand? Do you truly think me mad enough to agree to such terms? Failure. Samwell chuckled. My lord, do you honestly believe this endeavour will fail? Every enterprise hath its perils, Lord Mullendore retorted. More so when one ventures into the untamed wilds of the Red Mountains. Samwell laughed aloud. My lord, it seems you don't yet understand the true scope of this venture. Do you really think House Tyrell would go to such lengths merely to raid a few Dornish vessels? Lord Mullendore, holding back his impatience, inquired, oh? And what other motives would they have? Of course they have other motives. The Reach and Dorne have feuded for over 1,000 years, and now, with Lord Tyrell's eldest, Sir Willis, crippled by Prince Oberyn, they've all the more reason to seek retribution. Retaliate against Dorne. Mullendore looked skeptical. Dorne is not so easily invaded. You're correct, my lord. Dorne is, indeed, a fortress. Yet King Durin I conquered it without dragons, did he not? And while he claimed all the glory, those with wit know the true victory lay in Lord Alan Valerian's fleet, which seized Planky Town, gained control of the Greenblood River, and severed Dorne's defences. And Lady Olenna personally selected the site of my endeavour near the mouth of the Torrentine. Does that not resemble Planky Town? Samwell paused, observing Mullendore's reaction. He continued, seize control of the river's mouth, and the western Dornish lands shall fall as easily into the Reach's grasp as coins fall into a beggar's hand. Tell me, would House Tyrell allow such a venture to fail? Mullendore fell silent, absorbed in thought. Seeing his chance, Samwell continued, with House Tyrell determined to see this through, I can't fathom how such an endeavour could fail. The wild hill tribes in the Red Mountains, could they stand against Tyrell's finest soldiers? And do you imagine the Dornish will see through the Reach's designs and act first, preemptively striking to foil this venture? Mullendore shook his head. The disorganized hill tribes were no threat, and if the Dornish were foolish enough to strike first, provoking war, Lord Tyrell would welcome it. Dorne could never match the Reach in numbers, resources, or might. Centuries of resistance have only endured thanks to the mountains and deserts, yet should they forfeit these advantages, the Reach's armies would crush them utterly. Furthermore, the greatest obstacle in establishing a new hold in the Red Mountains securing funding had been solved by the audacious young knight before him, a man ready to stake his honor and future to make it happen. No, Lord Mullendore thought, the likelihood of failure seemed remote. Yet to risk his family's entire workforce was no light matter, and Mullendore hesitated. Seeing this, Samwell placed his cup upon the table. "Consider it, my lord. I shall linger here in Highgarden a few days, gathering supplies and provisions for the mountains. If you're willing to invest, you need only send word." With that, Samwell turned and exited the chamber. On the third day of waiting, Samwell still hadn't received a reply from Lord Mullendore. It seemed the lord was more prudent than Samwell had hoped, not so easily taken by grand words alone. However, Samwell did receive a letter from Lady Marjorie. Predictably, her letter contained rebukes for his reckless spending and yet another call to quicken his pace. The clever lady had, it seemed, learned from their exchanges, setting clear terms. From now on, he'd receive only 100 golden dragons monthly for his efforts. Any additional funds would require proof of progress in establishing his new hold or growing his population. Marjorie had indeed grown shrewd, effectively closing the door to Samwell's attempts at blatant extortion. This didn't come as a great surprise. House Tyrell would hardly serve as a limitless purse. But such polished use of management techniques was likely the handiwork of the Thorny Queen herself. Samwell took the news in stride. After all, he'd gained much from the Tyrells already, and the family's support had lent him an invaluable banner under which he could now entice other investors. Starting a new hold was, in essence, no different than starting a business. And who better to bankroll such ventures than investors? Yet, Highgarden's cautious lord seemed hard to convince. If Lord Mullendore didn't answer by tomorrow, Samwell planned to move on and seek a different source of funds. The Reach had many potential backers, and Samwell was determined to find one. Meanwhile, Lord Mullendore was making inquiries of his own. He had tracked down the Tyrell messenger and asked bluntly, "That letter you delivered to Samwell, who sent it?" The messenger gave a slight bow, politely declining. "Apologies, my lord, but I cannot disclose such information." However, a single golden coin prompted a more agreeable smile. It was from Lady Marjorie herself, with an additional 300 golden dragons enclosed. "Is that true?" Mullendore's gaze turned contemplative. "And I also saw you speak with Sir Todd Flowers." "Yes," the messenger replied, hesitating only briefly. Lady Olenna had sent word instructing Sir Todd to obey Lord Samwell's every command. The news made Lord Mullendore's expression darken. He stood silent for a long while. Chapter 17, The Beginning of Everything. "Lord Mullendore, so you have finally decided." Just as Samwell was preparing to depart Uplands, Lord Mullendore finally sent a messenger, requesting his return to the castle. In the reception room, Mullendore didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled out a bottle of red wine, smiling as he said, "This is wine from Dorne. Care for a taste?" "Of course." Samwell accepted the glass eagerly and took a sip. The wine was robust and full-bodied, with strong tannins and a sharp, spicy bite. Lord Mullendore also took a sip, remarking, "This was made from Syrah grapes grown in God's grace. Like the Dornish themselves, it's raw and bold, best be careful, or it'll catch you off guard." Samwell chuckled, draining his glass in one gulp. "I was blessed with a strong stomach, my lord. No matter how intense, any drink goes down smoothly." Lord Mullendore laughed along. "I'm beginning to wonder how someone like you ever gained such a reputation as a wastrel. Call it the folly of youth." Samwell waved off the comment, then got straight to business. "So, Lord Mullendore, regarding my proposal, I assume you've made your decision." The lord set down his glass, his face turning serious. "I have. This matter involves the centuries-old rivalry between the Reach and Dorne, and the Mullendores have no intention of standing idly by. So, I've decided to lend you every craftsman in my lands, including apprentices 275 in all for 1 year." Unable to hide his delight, Samwell immediately thanked him. "My lord, you are both a generous nobleman and a wise investor. Trust me, this investment will bring you great returns." "Hold on." Lord Mullendore raised a hand. "I'll require collateral, just as a precaution." "Collateral?" "Yes. Raiding merchant ships is hardly a simple matter. Should you fail to repay me in the future, I'll claim the collateral as compensation." Samwell's eyes flickered with thought, and then he replied, "In that case, how about using the most crucial feature of my future land, the port, as collateral?" "The port? And the rights to mooring fees and taxes there?" "Naturally, those will be yours as well." Lord Mullendore pondered this, then nodded. "Agreed." In his view, whether it was Samwell's piracy scheme or House Tyrell's larger plan against Dorne's western coast, both ventures would hinge on that vital port. By securing it as collateral, he was confident he could not lose. With the agreement in place, they discussed further details, drafted a contract, and both signed. To a prosperous partnership. To a prosperous partnership. With that, House Mullendore of Uplands formally became one of Samwell's backers. To gather the craftsmen from Uplands, the expedition delayed their departure by 3 days. This time, the expedition swelled to more than double its original size of 200, becoming an even more imposing force. As the leader, Samwell couldn't help but feel some pride. With this solid team in place, the most challenging stages of the settlement were likely to be smooth. As for the debt he'd incurred, he gave it little thought. As a former businessman, Samwell knew well that those who owe money are in a stronger position. The more he owed, the less his creditors would want to see his venture fail. In fact, he had another plan in mind. Once the settlement began construction, he would write to Lord Mullendore again, citing a shortage of labourers and requesting additional hands. Given Lord Mullendore's generosity, he'd likely oblige such a small request from a business partner. After all, if the port weren't completed in a year, wouldn't Mullendore be the one to lose out? With a larger force, however, the demand for food and resources also surged. Currently, the support from House Tyrell was barely covering their needs, and he would need more investors soon. But for now, the priority was reaching the designated territory. They had left Highgarden nearly 3 months ago, marking a slow march that must have set a record for the most leisurely expedition in Westerosi history. And with the trek now taking them deeper into the Red Mountains, the path ahead was likely to grow even more treacherous. There was even a chance of wildling attacks. Therefore, once they entered the mountains, Samwell suspended their usual military drills, conserving the soldiers' strength to prepare for any potential threats. But to Samwell's surprise, the journey proceeded without any harassment, despite the rough terrain. It seemed the wildlings were wise enough to recognize the strength of this party, with its 200 well-armed soldiers, and chose not to challenge it. There were, however, some foolish wild beasts that attacked the expedition. Needless to say, they ended up as dinner over the campfire. After nearly another month of brisk marching, the settlers finally glimpsed the summer sea in the distance. The salty, humid sea breeze blew away the mountain mists, bringing a sense of calm and fulfillment to the group. Samwell was just as delighted, and he hastened his pace. Heading southward, the terrain gradually evened out into a rare valley that stretched outward to form a rocky cape by the sea. "This is Eagle's Point," said Todd Flowers. "It's well suited as the site of your new holdfast, Lord Caesar." Samwell looked around and couldn't help but nod in agreement. It was an ideal location, flanked on both sides by mountains, backed by the summer sea, with only a narrow pass through the valley to the northwest. The central valley stretched over 10,000 acres. Though the rocky ground was too poor to farm, it was ample space to build a fortress, and the jutting shore was perfect for a port. The way Todd Flowers navigated this route suggested that House Tyrell had scouted the area before. Being deep in the Red Mountains, the site was difficult to reach and lacked farmland, meaning any stronghold here would be reliant on outside support. Apparently, House Tyrell hadn't been committed to founding a settlement here until Samwell came along. The original plan was likely for Todd Flowers to manipulate the cowardly pioneer knight, having him raid merchant ships in his own name to keep the hold afloat. Yet Samwell had no intention of following that plan. Piracy, if exposed, would ruin any chance of acceptance among Westerosi nobility. He'd end up like Yoram Mormont, who'd been disgraced for trading in slaves and had to flee across the narrow sea to join Daenerys. Actually, that didn't sound so bad. Samwell quickly shook his head, dismissing the thought as foolish. Since he'd taken the name Caesar, he would never settle for serving beneath anyone. If he intended to rise in the chaotic times to come, he needed a hold of his own and loyal soldiers to defend it. And here, at Eagle's Point, with 400 settlers at his command, lay the beginning of everything. Chapter 18, The Wildling Threat. A castle serves as the core structure for human dominion over land and as a visible declaration of a lord's sovereignty. In Westeros, the kingdom's pioneering edict follows this principle as well, Only upon the establishment of an approved castle will the kingdom officially recognize a lord's legitimate claim to their newly founded lands. Thus, upon reaching the designated territory, Samwell's primary goal was to establish a castle of his own. Only then could he become a legitimate lord in every sense of the word. Just after lunch, Samwell gathered the craftsmen from Highgarden to discuss the construction of the castle. "Lord Caesar, we conducted a preliminary survey of the area and have a rough plan to present to you," said a craftsman named Vito, a grey-bearded man in his 50s who commanded considerable respect among the Highgarden craftsmen. When Lord Mullendore had introduced him, he'd urged Samwell to look after this elder. "Please, go on, Master Vito," Samwell replied, always respectful to those with skill. Vito gave a small bow and then began his assessment. "My lord, we believe that the best location for your castle, suited to your noble status, would be in the northeastern corner of this valley. It's on higher ground and won't be affected by high tides. With mountains on two sides, it would save on the cost of constructing two stretches of the wall. Our initial design covers roughly 5 acres, with a main keep of 6 floors, 38 rooms, 2 basements, 3 outer baileys, a stable, a warehouse, 3 barracks, and 4 towers each 90 feet tall. The towers could support heavy crossbows and small trebuchets. The outer wall would be around 80 feet high, 12 feet thick, and constructed in 3 layers with stone, mortar, and a core of rubble for strength. Surrounding the wall, we could dig a moat by channeling seawater to add an additional layer of defense." Samwell listened intently, then asked, "And what would the total cost be for such a castle?" Vito stroked his long beard thoughtfully before answering, "Around 70,000 gold dragons." Samwell's face twitched. "And how long would it take?" "With our current workforce, roughly 5 years." Samwell's expression tightened further. "And if I were to gather more hands? Then we could complete it in perhaps half a year, though, of course, the cost would increase likely several times over." "Understood." Samwell nodded, his mood lifting slightly. He certainly couldn't wait 5 years. By then, the White Walkers might have arrived, and it would be too late to make a move in the Game of Thrones. He needed an entry ticket to that game well before then. The question now was how to gather such a large sum in a short time. He couldn't count on raising that much in further investments, no matter how many wealthy but gullible investors Westeros might have. Still, Samwell wasn't overly worried. He wouldn't have set out to establish a stronghold here if he hadn't had a plan. When he told Todd earlier that he had ways to generate income for the new lands, he hadn't been bluffing. But now wasn't the time to discuss that, he needed to settle in first. "Master Vito, since the castle will take time, let's start with a solid and secure encampment. Do you have any recommendations?" "My lord, I would suggest constructing a simple wooden fort for now. We could start by building a small hill of earth and stone at the entrance to the valley, on which we'd place a wooden tower with a beacon. On either side of this, we could erect 3 or 4 shorter arrow towers, all protected by a sturdy wooden palisade. A ditch could be dug outside the palisade for added defense, while inside the wall, we could build basic structures such as housing, a stable, and a blacksmith's workshop, all of wood. A temporary wooden fort would be cost-effective, quick to construct, and could provide adequate defense. Of course, it has its limitations. It's vulnerable to fire and lacks the durability of stone, meaning it wouldn't qualify as the core of a recognized domain by the kingdom. But for a transitional encampment, it's more than sufficient." Samwell smiled and nodded. "Good, Master Vito. I'll leave this in your capable hands." "Yes, my lord." Vito bowed, then added, "I also have some initial thoughts on the port construction." "Let's focus on the fort first," Samwell interrupted. "For now, put all efforts into constructing the fort and be sure to build enough barracks. I suspect we may be welcoming more companions soon." "As you wish, my lord." After arranging with the craftsman, Samwell turned to Todd Flowers. "Sir Todd, what are your thoughts on securing the encampment?" While tensions had arisen between them after Carter's death, neither had openly opposed the other. And on the journey here, Todd had proven himself invaluable. Once they reached the Red Mountains, Todd's experience was indispensable, helping them avoid wildling attacks and safely reach the northern shores of the Summer Sea. Thus, Samwell valued his advice on security. Todd didn't hold back, replying at once, "My lord, I recommend clearing all trees near the entrance to prevent anyone or anything from concealing themselves nearby. And although we haven't been attacked by wildlings, they have been shadowing us along the way, so we should remain vigilant. We ought to post guards outside the valley daily to monitor the surroundings. Agreed. Samwell nodded, then added after some thought, but unless they show hostility, let's avoid initiating conflict with the wildlings. If possible, I'd like to learn more about the local tribes' locations and even meet with their leaders. My lord, the wildlings in the Red Mountains bear us no goodwill. The only reason they haven't attacked us so far is that they see we have a large force. Be careful not to underestimate their threat. I understand the risk. But as a frontier lord, if we could bring some wildlings into the fold as subjects, our settlement would grow much faster. Todd didn't argue further and set off to follow Samwell's instructions. Soon, the quiet valley was bustling with activity. Meanwhile, Samwell led the recruits down to the seashore to catch fish and shrimp. Eagle's Point was remote, isolated within the mountains. Though they'd brought livestock and preserved meat, resources would have to be rationed. Fortunately, most of the recruits had worked as dock laborers, spending their lives along the Mander River and well-versed in fishing. By the end of the afternoon, the recruits had amassed a small mountain of seafood. Samwell was delighted at the prospect of a seafood feast that evening, but his plans were interrupted when Todd returned, looking grim. My lord, we've got trouble. The wildlings attacked the men cutting down trees, wounding 3 of them, and only 2 of the 3 scouting parties have returned. Chapter 19, Luring the Enemy. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow across the calm sea. A few seagulls swooped down, disrupting the shimmering reflection on the water. But Samwell had no mind for the beauty before him. He turned to Todd, who had just returned. The sentry group no sign of them yet. None, Todd replied grimly. And the wildlings who attacked? Have you tracked them? Not yet. They won't engage us head-on, only ambushing us and then disappearing into the mountains. We aren't familiar with the terrain and can't catch up. Todd clenched his jaw. I'm thinking of taking 10 men out further to see if we can find anything. Samwell was silent. Thinking that he might refuse, Todd's frustration flared. My lord, I sent those men out, and I will bring them back. Otherwise, I'm not stopping you from going to find them, Samwell interrupted. I just think you should take more men. Todd's expression softened a bit, though he shook his head. 10 will do. Any more, and the camp's security could be compromised. Samwell smiled slightly. That's exactly what I want the wildlings to think. What do you mean? Todd looked puzzled. You were right before. I underestimated their hostility. It's clear now they have no interest in peaceful exchange. If that's the case, then we need to show them who's in charge. Samwell's eyes held a glint of steel. Take all the Tyrell soldiers with you and make it appear the camp is vulnerable. I'll stay with my men to lure them in, and you'll circle back at the right moment and trap them in the valley. Todd stared, incredulous. My lord, wouldn't that be too risky? We don't even know how many wildlings there are. Samwell replied calmly, a pack of skulking wildlings, what is there to fear? If they were capable of facing us head-on, why rely on sneak attacks? Todd hesitated. Wouldn't it be wiser to get a sense of their numbers first? And how do you propose we do that? Samwell cut in sharply. This is the Red Mountains, it's their terrain. We can't even catch a glimpse of them here. Seeing Todd look away, Samwell continued coolly, now is the best time to strike. Once we build the watchtower and secure the barricades, any feigned weakness won't fool them into attacking us. If we delay, they'll simply wear us down with hit-and-run tactics, lurking unseen. The constant harassment would cripple the development of the settlement, and we'd be forever trapped here. We need to act now, while our position is still vulnerable. Let them come in for what they think is an easy target, then strike hard enough that they won't dare try it again. Todd considered his words, and then, gritting his teeth, he nodded. Very well. Since you have the courage, and you trust me to handle this, I will not disappoint you. He struck his chest in a knightly salute and departed. Turning to find his squire Gavin, Samwell noticed his hesitation. What is it? He asked. Gavin lowered his voice. My lord, aren't you worried Todd Flowers might deliberately leave you to die? Samwell gave his young squire a long look and then smiled. Don't worry. Todd is no fool. He wouldn't make such a reckless choice. Besides, all our supplies are here. If he abandoned us to the wildlings, what would he do with 100 men and no supplies? Even if he escaped, would the Tyrells spare him? Gavin hesitated but persisted, My lord, what if he delays on purpose? Even if he doesn't abandon us, he might wait until we're battered by the wildlings. Why not switch roles? Let him stay to defend the valley while you lead the sortie and then return in the midst of battle. Samwell shook his head. All of you are green recruits, better suited to hold a fortified position. Leaving the feint and re-entry to Todd and his seasoned men makes more sense. Seeing that Gavin wanted to protest further, Samwell cut him off. Gavin, do you know what's most dangerous in a battle? My lord, what is it? Distrust and division among one's own. Samwell's tone was deadly serious. No matter our differences, Todd and I stand on the same side against the wildlings. If I made him defend the valley, he'd sense I don't trust him. We'd lose spirit before the fight even began. And if we won, it would leave a rift between us that would never heal. I understand, my lord, Gavin murmured, lowering his head. Samwell's tone softened. Good. Tell the men we may face a wildling assault tonight. Have them eat early, get some rest, and keep their armor on and weapons close. And find Vito for me. Yes, my lord. In truth, Samwell's trust in Todd also stemmed from a recent letter from Marjorie, which had included a warning, he was to refrain from indiscriminate killing, and that Todd would now be under his command. That subtle remark had alerted Samwell that Lady Olenna's view of him might have changed. Initially, she'd likely regarded him as a controllable puppet. But after seeing him take decisive action, she'd apparently revised her stance, granting him more freedom to act. For now, Todd could be trusted. However, Samwell knew that if he failed to prove his worth, Todd would undoubtedly step in to assume control. This was, after all, Lady Olenna. There would be no leniency. That was why this upcoming battle was so crucial. It was not only a test of his recruits, who had been given proper arms, food, and training over the past 4 months. This was the moment for them to prove their worth. If they won this battle, these recruits would emerge as his first cohort of seasoned soldiers. All they had to do was win. As Samwell pondered, Gavin returned with Vito in tow. Shaking off his reverie, Samwell shared his plans with Vito, and together they discussed ways to bolster their defenses. It was too late to complete the watchtower, or even the palisades. Fortunately, the craftsmen had already created a small mound at the valley's entrance, which they could reinforce as a defensive point. The entrance was narrow, just wide enough for 6 or 7 men to pass abreast. From the mound, Samwell's men would have the high ground. With the plan set, Samwell instructed Vito to gather some stones and logs to be stacked atop the mound. As the sun finally sank below the horizon, Todd and his men slipped out of the camp. The craftsmen worked on the defenses, while Samwell and his soldiers rested, conserving their strength. Staring up at the vast, starry sky, Samwell found sleep elusive. Listening to the rhythmic pounding of waves on the rocks, his mind drifted to memories from his previous life. Though not long ago, it felt like an eternity. The night deepened, thick with the sense that something was brewing, gathering strength. Chapter 20, Night Assault. The deep blare of a horn shattered the silent night. Samwell, who had barely slept, jolted awake and leapt to his feet, shouting, "Form ranks! Form ranks!" In the brief chaos that followed, the recruits quickly assembled around Samwell. Discipline and order, these had been the cornerstones of the 4 months of training Samwell had drilled into them. Through constant repetition and reinforcement, discipline had seeped into their blood, becoming a part of them, like muscle memory. In the dim moonlight, Samwell could make out shadows filtering into the valley's narrow entrance. The wildlings had taken the bait. Hearing the horn, the wildlings realized they'd been spotted, and they abandoned any pretense of stealth, unleashing eerie howls. "Awoo! Shay-la-la-la-la-la! Ya-ya-ya-ya-ya-ya!" The valley rang with their wild cries, startling animals from their slumber and filling the camp with dread. There were so many of them, too many. The darkness concealed their exact numbers, but the volume and force of their cries suggested hundreds, perhaps thousands. Could they hold the line against such odds? Standing on a small hill at the valley's entrance, Samwell looked out at the dark mass surging towards him. Strangely, he felt an extraordinary calm, a coldness that even he found surprising. This stillness in the face of danger was something he had never attained in his previous life, but somehow, he'd come to possess it here. The last time he'd felt this way was when he decided to kill Carter. Before the act, he'd been plagued with doubt, fear, even nausea. But in the moment he'd confronted Carter's hanging body, his mind had been clear, even when Todd had roared in fury. He had acted without hesitation. Now, he felt the same. Earlier, lying sleepless, he'd wrestled with thoughts of Todd's loyalty, the wildlings' numbers, and the possibility that his training was just a joke. He'd worried that he might die here, untested, in an obscure valley. But now, facing the sea of charging wildlings, he felt no fear, no doubt, only the cold resolve to fight to the end. Release. At Samwell's command, the soldiers released the stones and logs they'd prepared, sending them tumbling down the hillside. Boom boom. Under the force of gravity, the rocks and logs hurtled down the slope, smashing into the wildlings' ranks at the valley's entrance. Blood splattered, screams filled the air. This initial blow struck hard, dampening the wildlings' reckless fervor and giving the anxious recruits a brief reprieve. Shields up! Samwell's voice rang out again. The front row of soldiers reflexively raised their large wooden shields, watching the oncoming wildlings with wary eyes. In the moonlight, they could see the wildlings' faces twisted in rage. Fear was inevitable, yet they stood their ground. Their comrades were beside them, their lord was behind them. For over 4 months, Samwell had drilled them not in complex techniques but in the simplest battle maneuvers. His demands were few but absolute: precision, unity, and obedience. Countless repetitions had drilled these commands into their bones. Even though tension and fear gnawed at them, when they heard the order, they responded without thought. Alone, each of these recruits would be stiff, clumsy, and vulnerable in a fight. But together, as a unit, they became a formidable machine of death. Even Samwell himself may not have fully realized the significance of such order and discipline in medieval warfare. But tonight, here in the depths of the Red Mountains, this fledgling army would reveal its blood-stained fangs. Thud, thud, thud. Some of the men in the front ranks closed their eyes as they braced against the wildlings' first wave. The shields held. This was no surprise. Wooden shields offered modest protection, but the wildlings' weapons were cruder still. Living in the harsh Red Mountains, the wildlings had no means of forging fine weapons. Iron was scarce, and most of their armaments were crude stone hammers, wooden spears, and sharpened animal bones. And attacking from below uphill further weakened their blows. Watching the scene coldly, Samwell gave his second order. Spears! Shwick, shwick. The spearmen behind the shield-bearers thrust their weapons through gaps in the line. Squelch! The sound of spears piercing flesh filled the night. After a few rounds, the ranks of wildlings in the valley began to thin. Blades out! At Samwell's third command, the men in the last row drew their long swords, slicing through the wildlings still writhing in agony. The swordsmen would strike, then retreat back into formation, and the shield-bearers would brace for the next charge. Over and over, the cycle continued. After several rounds, Samwell saw the soldiers' exhaustion and called. First group, fall back. Second group, forward. With the valley's narrow entrance as a bottleneck, Samwell had divided his men into 3 groups, each taking turns. The weapons and formations were identical for each group. Shield, spear, blade. Simple, repetitive, tedious. But ruthlessly effective. Not long into the fight, the slope leading to the valley was littered with wildling bodies. Even the newly recruited soldiers were surprised by their own deadly impact. Yes, they were clumsy, tense, and made mistakes, but the wildlings could do little against them. Their armor protected them from most blows. Well-made gear, favorable terrain, coordinated formations, effective tactics, and Samwell's commanding presence created a rhythm of engagement and retreat, strike and reset. The soldiers became faster and more confident with each round. The blood staining their bodies washed away their inexperience. For a recruit to become a veteran, the transformation required little more than this: survive 1 battle, take 1 life, and live to see another day. These young men, once laborers recruited from the docks of the Mandar, were undergoing their transformation tonight. With each passing moment, they grew more efficient, their movements sharper and more unified. The wildlings charged with blind bravery, but they could not break this seemingly fragile line. All they left behind were their dead. The stench of blood filled the valley as Samwell's troops, guided by his commands, coalesced into a machine designed solely to kill. Life was its fuel, blood its lubricant, and the fear in its enemies' eyes was its highest reward. Chapter 21, Warriors. Why haven't they broken through yet? Asked a young wildling, his tone laced with irritation. The speaker had a long, horse-like face, dark skin, and a sturdy, muscular frame. Around his neck hung a necklace made of animal fangs. Experienced hunters could tell these were all Tiger Fangs, each one marking him as a member of the Tiger Fang clan, a renowned tribe in the Red Mountains. For the warriors of the Tiger Fang clan, hunting tigers was the highest honor. After a warrior killed a tiger, he would take its largest, sharpest fang and wear it as a trophy. This man's necklace was densely adorned with such fangs, including one that was over 5 inches long, a testament to the size and strength of the beasts he had felled. Beside him stood 2 other young men, who closely resembled him in appearance. Their own necklaces were also crowded with tiger fangs. These 3 were the famed 3 brothers of valor, sons of the chieftain of the Tiger Fang clan, one of the strongest tribes in the region. The eldest was Chika, followed by his brothers Chimu and Chiman. After discovering the settlers' trail, the 3 brothers had begun gathering warriors from neighboring tribes, aiming to drive these invaders out of their territory. The wildling tribes of the Red Mountains often fought amongst themselves, but when it came to facing the Riverlanders, they were natural allies. Seeing that the settlers had brought over 200 well-armed, well-trained soldiers, the 3 brothers held back, shadowing the settlers from a distance while they gathered more warriors. By the time the settlers reached their destination and began setting up camp, Chika grew anxious. He could tell that the settlers had chosen a strategically defensive valley. If the Riverlanders managed to fortify this camp or, worse, build a castle, the wildlings would lose control over this land for good. Thanks to the fearsome reputation of the Tiger Fang clan, they'd managed to rally over 2,000 wildling warriors, yet Chika still hesitated to launch a full assault. Against the Riverlanders' regular soldiers, the wildlings were disadvantaged in weaponry and strength. Only with an advantage of 10 to 1 or more would they dare to attack head-on. Though they now had that numerical advantage, the Riverlanders held the high ground in the valley, so Chika had been waiting for even more wildling reinforcements. However, he couldn't wait too long, as the settlers were likely to complete additional defenses over time. In the end, he sent raiding parties to harass the settlers, hoping to delay their fortifications and test their fighting capabilities. They even captured 2 scouts who had ventured out alone. What happened next surprised Chika, though. The Riverlanders responded with unusual intensity, as if their camp had been swarmed by hornets. By evening, over 100 fully armed soldiers had marched out, searching for their missing comrades. This pleased Chika. The captured scouts had revealed that the settler force consisted of 200 soldiers, half of whom were Tyrell family regulars, while the other half were newly recruited levies. Now, that main force of Tyrell soldiers had left the camp. This was the perfect chance. As a skilled hunter, Chika knew never to hesitate when prey exposed a weakness. As soon as he confirmed that the Tyrell troops were out of range, he ordered the attack on the camp. To Chika, the thought of 100 newly trained recruits and a so-called useless noble holding a defensive position even with favorable terrain was laughable. How could they possibly withstand an assault by over 2,000 wildling warriors? But as the battle began, he sensed something was wrong. The resistance within the camp was far fiercer than expected. The narrow, shadowed valley entrance seemed an endless abyss, devouring the lives of his warriors. "It should fall soon," said Chiman, the youngest of the 3, trying to sound reassuring. "There are only about 100 green soldiers inside the camp. By now, they must have suffered heavy losses." "And our warriors?" asked a chieftain from one of the allied tribes. "How many have we lost so far?" The question brought a tense silence over the group. Under the cover of darkness, none could see the extent of the losses. All they heard were the sounds of violent combat and the thick stench of blood. The eldest, Chika, abruptly stood up and unsheathed his blade. "I'll go in myself and lead the charge." At his words, the gathered wildlings looked relieved, as if the moment their famed warrior entered the fray, victory would be assured. Chika took only a few steps before feeling a hand grasp his arm. "What is it, Chiman?" His youngest brother, Chiman, leaned in, whispering urgently. "Brother, something feels off. This could be a trap." "A trap?" Chika paused, frowning. "Yes. Think about it, if we keep struggling to break through this camp and those Tyrell soldiers return unexpectedly, what would happen?" Chika's eyes widened briefly, but he quickly narrowed them again. Clapping his brother on the shoulder, he replied. "You may be right, but it's too late to turn back. You and Chimu keep watch behind us. If the Tyrell soldiers come back, hold them off at all costs. Once I break through the valley, this battle is ours, and every Riverlander inside will die." With that, Chika strode off without hesitation. Chiman sighed inwardly. He knew his brother was right. Realizing it was a trap now wouldn't help, their warriors were packed tightly within the valley entrance, and retreat would be impossible. More importantly, if they fled without a fight, the Tiger Fang clan's reputation would be destroyed. At this point, the three brothers had only one choice: forward, not back. As Chimon prepared himself mentally, a wildling ran up, shouting in alarm. "They're back! The Tyrell soldiers are returning!" Chimon's heart sank. They had indeed fallen into the trap. But he knew that panicking now would spell disaster. If fear took root, the loosely allied wildling force would likely collapse. Turning to the others, he forced a calm smile and declared loudly. "Why worry? It's only 100 soldiers. I'll take 300 warriors and hold them off." Inspired by Chimon's bravery, the wildlings around him steadied themselves, many muttering praises of the three brothers of valor. Knowing they needed to act fast, Chimon quickly found his second brother, Chimu, and gathered 300 warriors, arranging them in ranks outside the valley to confront the approaching Tyrell soldiers. As he eyed the advancing Tyrell forces, Chimon forced himself to keep calm, quelling the worry gnawing at him. So what if it was a trap? As one of the finest warriors of the Tiger Fang clan, Chimon had skirted the edge of death countless times. But never had he allowed an enemy to see his back. "Warriors of the mountains, charge with me!" Chapter 22, The Rout. Shields up! Spear, thrust! Swords, advance! On the hill at the mouth of the valley, Samwell's voice was already hoarse. But his expression was growing more relaxed by the moment. The battle had raged long enough for the green recruits to be reborn in blood, and Samwell now felt a solid faith in his own hard-earned military tactics. In battles dominated by melee weapons, the best weapons were disciplined formations, strict order, and unwavering cohesion. The slope littered with wildling corpses testified to this theory. Samwell could sense the enemy's momentum crumbling. Their assaults were weakening, and it wouldn't be long before the wildlings lost heart entirely, abandoning any thought of renewing their attacks on the hill. Even without Todd Flowers launching an ambush from behind, Samwell was confident his recruits could hold the valley's entrance. Seeing the mass of wildlings packed into the narrow pass below, Samwell idly wished for a few archers on hand. If he could rain down volleys into those tightly clustered ranks, the enemy's morale would collapse completely. Of course, that was just a dream for now. Training archers was no small task. 4 months was hardly enough. Besides, archers were a costly investment. Perhaps, he mused, once his future stronghold grew prosperous. And what about cavalry, you ask? That's even more expensive. Attack! A bellow, like thunder exploding at close range, ripped Samwell from his thoughts. He whirled just in time to see one of his shield-bearers flung back like a broken kite, tumbling through the air before hitting the ground, chest caved in as blood gushed from his mouth. What just happened? To his horror, Samwell saw a hulking wildling warrior burst through the shield line, wielding a great sword with terrifying might. A necklace of tiger fangs gleamed menacingly across his chest. "Stop him!" With a mighty swing, Chika shattered another shield, shards flying in all directions, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the commander on the hill. "Die!" With a roar like a charging tiger, Chika barreled towards Samwell. In a heartbeat, Samwell realized he couldn't dodge in time. He braced himself, gripping his sword with all his strength to block the blow. Clang! The clash rang out, and Samwell's sword flew from his hand. The impact hurled him backwards like he'd been struck by a battering ram, pain searing through his chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe. If not for his chain mail, that blow would have split him open right then and there. Even before he could catch his breath, Chika was upon him again, bringing his sword down with merciless precision. The reek of death hit Samwell's face like a foul wind, chilling him to his core. With a final burst of effort, he scrambled, hands and knees clawing at the ground like a lizard to dodge aside. Thud! Chika's great sword cleaved into the earth, kicking up dirt and stones that left shallow cuts across Samwell's face. Only by inches had he kept his head. Struggling to rise, Samwell found his limbs leaden and numb. Chika advanced again. "Protect Lord Caesar!" The soldiers finally cried, rushing forward to block the wildling. Gulping in precious breaths, Samwell noticed the iron taste of blood filling his mouth. What a terrifying warrior! And what brutal strength! Even with months of grueling training and the golden-tailed shrimp supplements, Samwell's own strength was well above average, now reaching a 1.32 rating. Yet against this fearsome wildling, it had been nothing. Inwardly, Samwell guessed that Chica's strength was likely over 3, perhaps much higher. Second squad, advance. Hold the line. Third squad, encircle that wildling. With his breath finally steady, Samwell barked out orders. This was the advantage of having reserves. The breached line was swiftly restored. No matter how powerful Chica was, surrounded by dozens of spears and shields, there wasn't much he could do. In war, individual prowess was limited. Samwell admitted it had been a close call. This wildling possessed fearsome strength and deadly timing. Had he succeeded in killing Samwell, it might have turned the tide. But fortune had just barely stayed on Samwell's side. Now, encircled by over a dozen soldiers, Chica could only lunge and stumble, bleeding from multiple wounds. In a final, desperate bid, the caged Chica threw his sword at Samwell with all his might. Die! But Samwell, watching the wildling's every move, quickly grabbed a wooden shield from a nearby soldier and braced himself. Thud! The sword punched through the shield, though Samwell's chainmail absorbed the rest. Still, the sheer force sent him stumbling 3 steps back, nearly dropping him on his backside. Swallowing the blood that surged into his mouth, Samwell staggered to his feet and shouted, "Kill him! Kill!" Seeing the wildling unarmed, the soldiers charged forward. Roar! Chica bellowed, appearing ready to charge once more at Samwell. The soldiers closed ranks, determined to protect their lord at all costs. But to their surprise, Chica suddenly pivoted and bolted toward the valley entrance. A warrior so fierce, now fleeing? It caught the soldiers off guard, and the wildling managed to break free. "Don't pursue. Hold the line," Samwell ordered. Though he longed to see that wildling slain, he knew preserving the defense took priority. Besides, the wildling was gravely wounded and no longer a threat. Chica's reckless breakthrough had caused momentary chaos among the defenders, but this proved to be his last flash of strength. The wildlings could no longer threaten the line on the hill. And Samwell could hear sounds of fierce fighting echoing from outside the valley. Todd had finally returned with his men. A cheer erupted within the camp as morale soared. Across the valley, the wildlings' energy waned. They tried to rally and attack several more times, but the defenders on the hill held firm, an impenetrable fortress. With the front blocked and an attack coming from the rear, the wildlings trapped within the valley began to panic, fear creeping over them. Finally, the first light of dawn pierced the darkness, illuminating the ravaged valley. The sight before them was a vision of hell. From the valley mouth to the defensive line, the entire 100-foot slope was blanketed with wildling corpses. Amid the carnage, a few wounded wildlings still gasped for breath, their agonized cries begging for release. Blood soaked the ground, turning it a deep, dark red. The stench hung in the air, thick and suffocating. This apocalyptic scene broke the last vestiges of wildling morale. Their ranks collapsed. No longer could they muster any meaningful resistance. Some fled, others wept uncontrollably, and still others sat in shock, as though paralyzed by terror. Samwell seized the moment, his voice booming over the valley. "Lay down your weapons, surrender, and you'll live." The soldiers pushed forward, shouting in unison. "Lay down your weapons, surrender, and you'll live. Lay down your weapons, surrender, and you'll live." Chapter 23, The Judgment. The first rays of dawn pierced through the clouds, casting a soft golden light over the mountains. On blood-stained soil, nameless weeds greedily soaked up the remains of the fallen, striving to grow taller and stronger. High above, vultures circled, eager to swoop down and feast. Though Samwell had gone without sleep, he appeared full of energy, directing his men to clear the battlefield and secure the prisoners. The victory was theirs at last, and a resounding one. Samwell understood the immense significance of this victory for him. First, his recruits, tempered by the flames of battle, were no longer mere novices but a formidable force he could truly depend on. Second, his own reputation had soared after this victory. Once dismissed as a fool among the nobility of the Reach, now he saw respect and admiration in the eyes of those around him. They now regarded him as a true leader, a lord capable of carving out new territory. And most importantly, this victory meant that his new territory would no longer need to fear raids from wildlings, at least, not in this valley. No nearby wildling tribe would have the courage or strength to threaten him. Just then, Todd approached, bowing respectfully to Samwell and reporting. "My lord, the initial tally from the battle has been completed." The knight from House Tyrell was clearly more respectful than he had been before. "What's the result?" We lost 21 men, with another 30-some badly wounded. But we killed over 230 wildlings and captured nearly 1,000. Todd, the seasoned warrior, could scarcely believe it himself. He'd seen his share of battles but had never encountered such astonishing results, especially knowing that most of those under Samwell's command were green recruits facing an enemy with crude weapons and chaotic organization. Even so, such a sweeping victory placed the young knight firmly among the Reach's most skilled commanders. House Tarly truly does raise remarkable generals, Todd thought. At this moment, Todd no longer dared associate Samwell with that disparaging label of useless. Either that had been a grievous misunderstanding or a product of some foul conspiracy within House Tarly itself. Good. Make sure our wounded are cared for, and issue the death gratuities I promised to the families of the fallen. You can speak with Gavin for the funds. Yes, my lord. Have we captured the wildling leaders? Yes. The attack was led by the Tiger Fang clan, and it was organized by the chieftain's 3 sons. They've all been captured. Excellent. Bring them to me. Yes, my lord. When the Tiger Fang brothers were brought before him, Samwell recognized one of them as the fearsome warrior who'd nearly ended his life during the battle. So, we meet again, Samwell greeted with a grin. And what's your name? Chica, he snarled through gritted teeth, his blood-red eyes fixed on Samwell, as though ready to tear his throat out at any moment. Samwell, however, felt no fear in the face of a defeated warrior, especially one whose hands and feet were bound. Chica, we had no quarrel, and I never harmed your clan. So, why did you attack us? Chica scoffed, rage flashing in his eyes. You reach folk everywhere you go, you take land and build castles, chop down forests, and hunt our beasts. These lands and creatures are the gifts of the gods, meant for us. And you destroy them. You still wonder why we fight you. These resources don't bear your name, Samwell replied coolly. What makes you think they're yours alone? Why not share and develop them together? Humph. You won. The forest is yours. Why waste breath? Chica sneered. If you mean to kill, then kill. No warrior of Tiger Fang fears death. Oh. Samwell eyed the defiant brothers, an idea forming. Well, I never said I intended to kill you. You're not going to kill us. Chica's brows knit in surprise. Are you planning to make us your slaves? Samwell shook his head again. Enslaving others is an affront to the Seven and is prohibited by the laws of the kingdom. If not slaves, do you mean to set us free? Chimu, the second brother, asked in disbelief. To their surprise, Samwell nodded. Ha! As if you'd be so kind. Chica's tone was thick with doubt. I've no desire to make enemies of the wildlings, Samwell said earnestly. You gave me no chance to show you goodwill. As I said, nature's bounty isn't yours alone. We could work together as partners, allies, even kin. Empty words. You Reach nobles speak well, Chica scoffed, but you just want us to bow to you. Samwell laughed. Isn't it natural to submit to the strong? Isn't that the way in your clans? At this, Chica fell silent. Strength did rule in the wildling tribes, after all. After a pause, he muttered, only the chieftain of the Tiger Fang clan, our father, could decide if we'd submit to you. That's why I'd like to meet him. Fine. Then release us, along with our clansmen. Samwell shook his head. You inflicted significant losses upon us. There must be some recompense. What recompense? The captured warriors will stay to help build my castle and can only leave once it's complete. So, you would enslave them. Earlier, you said no slaves. Typical noble hypocrisy. Chica sneered. Samwell ignored him and continued, and the 3 of you must also pay a price for starting this conflict. What punishment? Over 100 died because of you. The punishment, therefore, must be death. Chica laughed. So you do mean to kill us? Were those noble promises just lies? No, Samwell replied calmly. Only one of you will die. I'll spare the other 2 as a sign of my desire for peace with the Tiger Fang clan. The brothers blinked in shock before, almost in unison, asking. Who do you mean to kill? Samwell gave a sly smile. I'll let you decide among yourselves who will die to atone for the fallen. With his words, the air around them grew tense. Chapter 24, Submission. The once defiant Tiger Fang brothers suddenly fell silent. No one wished to die, especially when the chance of survival lay before them. Had Samwell declared he would kill all three, they would likely have held their heads high, facing death with pride. But when he announced only one of them would die, leaving the other two to walk free, the mood shifted. The mighty warriors grew meek, heads bowed, silent. "Well? Have you three brave men made a decision yet?" Samwell prompted. Still, none of them spoke. Samwell scoffed. "Very well. Which of you first proposed this attack on my settlers?" "That man can atone." Awkward silence ensued. "What's this? Three fearless warriors who can't even admit the truth." Samwell threatened. "If none of you speak up, I'll just pick one at random." It was Chimon who suggested it first. The second brother, Chimu, muttered. Samwell's mouth curved into a slight smile as he asked, "And which one is Chimon?" He didn't need an answer, he'd already found Chimon, whose furious eyes turned to Chimu. "Chimu! Are you so eager to see me die?" Avoiding his younger brother's gaze, Chimu stammered, "Well, you were the one who suggested the plan." "The plan was our decision as brothers. Why should I bear it alone? Death is just death, let us face it together." Samwell interjected, "Chimon, now that won't do. We need your bloodline to live on, don't we?" "So, it's settled on Chimon, then? Chika, as the eldest, do you agree?" Chimon turned to his eldest brother, who was now silent, eyes downcast. With a bitter laugh, Chimon demanded, "Brother, do you wish me dead too?" Chika said nothing. Silence speaks for itself. Samwell drew his sword and approached Chimon from behind. "If your brothers wish for your death, so be it." Chimon ignored the approaching sword, his gaze locked on his brothers, as though trying to see their true selves clearly. Swish! The sword came down. But Chimon felt no pain. Instead, he felt his bonds fall loose. Startled, he turned to find that Samwell had severed his ropes. At Chimon's bewildered expression, Samwell smiled and said, "Oh, I've changed my mind. Only one of you gets to live." With that, he tossed the sword in front of the three brothers. At the beginning, such a move would have been pointless, they wouldn't have turned against each other so easily. But now, things were different. No sooner had the sword hit the ground than Chimu scrambled toward it. A betrayal is like crossing a line, you either never do it or do it repeatedly. But still bound, Chimu's struggle for the sword was pitiful against Chimon, who was already free. "Brother, please, listen." Chimu stammered, trying to flash a brotherly smile as he faced the blade pointing at his chest. "I only told the truth. It's that damned noble who wants you dead. Can't you see? He forced me to do it, forced me." Thud. The sword pierced Chimu's heart. He died by his own brother's hand. Samwell gave a mocking clap, a blend of applause and ridicule. Pointing to Chika, he said, "There's still one left." Chimon pulled the sword free and moved toward Chika, his voice hoarse like a soul from the depths of the underworld, "Brother, look at me." Chika, however, kept his head lowered. "Look at me!" Chimon roared, wounded and raging. At last, Chika raised his eyes but looked toward Samwell instead. Samwell met his gaze without flinching. "You're a devil," Chika spat, seething. Samwell returned a calm smile. "The devil was already within you, I only brought him out." Tiger Fang warriors. Brotherly love? All lies, as fragile as glass. You accuse nobles of deceit while ignoring the lies within yourself. Look at me!" Chimon shouted, relentless. Finally, Chika turned to his brother, shame filling his eyes. "Did you wish me dead just now?" Chimon asked, his gaze unwavering. Chika didn't answer, but said softly, "Brother, kill me and flee as far as you can. Don't seek revenge. He's a devil of the mind. You'll never win against him." Through clenched teeth, Chimon replied, "What right do you have to tell me what to do?" Chika let out a weary sigh, lifted his head, and closed his eyes, awaiting his end. Chimon's face flickered with sorrow, anger, and finally, determination. He plunged the sword into his brother's heart. The hot blood spurted, covering Chimon. He stumbled backward, frozen, like a stone statue. Samwell's voice broke the silence. "Very good. I keep my word, you're free to go. Tell your father I'm not a man who revels in bloodshed. Rather than destroy, I would prefer your tribe's submission. So, if he's willing to submit, let him come meet me here. I will welcome all the Tiger Fang clan as my own people. But if not? Samwell's voice chilled, he'd best have warriors enough to face our swords. Chimon stood as if he hadn't heard Samwell, lost in shock. What? Afraid to return to your tribe? Don't worry, I'll keep your fratricide to myself if you no longer stand against me. Chimon finally looked up, his face streaked with blood, his expression ghastly. Though his appearance remained the same, he seemed transformed, almost unrecognizable. My lord, he rasped, my father may never submit to you. Oh. Samwell raised an eyebrow in surprise. Why is that? Does he truly have more warriors? Chimon shook his head. No. The warriors are dead or captured, and the rest are too frightened to fight. But even so, my father will not submit. To him, it would be a death sentence. A death sentence? Yes. A reach noble would kill him. Samwell felt a glimmer of understanding. Did your father once harm a reach noble? Chimon nodded. In his youth, he raided the plains and killed a member of House Hightower. Now Samwell understood. With House Hightower's influence in the Reach, even he could not protect the Tiger Fang chieftain. And why are you telling me this? Samwell asked, intrigued by this wildling's intentions. Because I want you to know, my father will never kneel. But I will. With that, Chimon suddenly dropped to his knees and crawled forward, pressing his forehead to Samwell's feet. He cried out in a voice that shook the ground. Noble and great knight, I, Chimon, swear my allegiance to you. I pledge to be your sword, to clear your path of all obstacles. Let the gods be witness, that should I break this vow, may my blood be spilled unto death. Samwell looked down at the wildling kneeling before him, considering. Finally, he said, I accept your fealty. Chapter 25, New Subjects. The Tiger Fang tribe's camp was located about 20 miles northeast of Eagle's Nest. The camp was built on a clearing by a lake and fortified with a double-layer fence made of iron oak that rose 20 feet high, with over a dozen tall watchtowers within. Outside the fence, a man-made moat connected the camp to the lake, creating a natural island fortress. Although such defenses couldn't rival the castles of the nobility, the Tiger Fang camp was well fortified. Who goes there? From a watchtower, a wildling archer aimed his bow at a figure approaching the camp gate, shouting his question. Since the retreating survivors from Eagle's Nest had returned, a heavy tension hung over the camp. The crushing defeat had decimated the tribe's fighting force, nearly wiping out its strength, a disaster they would struggle to survive. It's me, Chimon. Hearing the familiar voice, the wildling guard lowered his bow and quickly opened the gate. Chimon walked into the camp in silence, asking only, "Where's my father?" The chieftain fell ill upon hearing of the defeat. Expressionless, Chimon gave a short nod. "Take me to him." Right away. Led by a servant, Chimon arrived at a small cabin by the lake. Inside, a brazier filled the air with smoke as the tribe's shaman tossed strange plants into the fire, muttering incantations under his breath. Amid the swirling smoke, Chimon spotted his father lying on a bed, covered in various animal fangs. "Leave us," Chimon ordered. The shaman hesitated but then led the servants out of the cabin. Hearing footsteps, the old chieftain opened his eyes, and looking up at his youngest son, parted his dry lips to ask weakly, "Where are Chika and Chimu?" "They're dead," Chimon replied, his face unreadable. The old chieftain shut his eyes in pain, his body trembling slightly as he tried to control his emotions. After a long pause, he finally spoke, voice wavering. "Immediately write letters in my name to the 14 nearby tribes. Tell them the Reach has invaded the mountains that the gods gifted us. If they do not wish to be driven from their ancestral lands, they must join together, so that we may fight back." "Father!" Chimon interrupted, his voice calm. "Do you truly want more of our warriors to bleed for this?" The chieftain's eyes flashed with anger as he looked at his son. "What's this? Has one defeat taken your courage?" Chimon met his father's gaze without flinching. "This isn't a matter of courage. Father, you've met the Reachmen, you've fought their armies. Do you not understand the true gap between us? Are our warriors any less brave? No. Our failing isn't in courage. It's the mountains of bread and dried meat they can stockpile, the well-crafted steel weapons, the knights raised for war, and their unbreakable castles. Without these, even if we gather every tribe, we can never hope to defeat the Reach." The chieftain's face flushed with anger, and he was seized by a fit of coughing. "What do you suggest, then?" Should we surrender to the reach and live as slaves? Not slaves, subjects. Subjects. The chieftain scoffed. Have you seen the people under these nobles? They're no different from slaves. Chimon retorted, and what of our people? They're worse off than the slaves you speak of. What are you saying? The chieftain coughed violently, struggling to breathe. Chimon watched his father's suffering without a trace of pity, even adding fuel to the fire. You're old, father. Your stubbornness will only drag the Tiger Fang tribe into despair. Silence! Wheezed the chieftain. What? You think you should lead the tribe now? Just wait until I'm dead, then. Fine. Before the words left his father's mouth, Chimon grabbed a tiger pelt from the bed and pressed it down over the old man's face. Ugh! The old chieftain struggled wildly, but his youngest son's strength held him firm. In the firelight, their shadows played upon the cabin walls. Father and son locked in a final, grim struggle. Eventually, the chieftain's struggle ceased. Chimon carefully laid the tiger pelt back over his father, replacing the scattered animal fangs in their proper places. He stared at his father's face for a long moment, then forced himself to look stricken. His expression now filled with panic. He cried out, "Father! What's wrong? Father! Shaman! Shaman!" The shaman, hearing the calls, hurried back inside. "Quick, look at my father! He just fainted." The shaman felt for the old chieftain's breath, recoiling in shock as he realized the truth. He turned to meet Chimon's icy gaze. Realization dawning, the shaman quickly lowered his head and said, "My apologies, Chimon. The chieftain has returned to the gods." "What? Father?" Chimon collapsed over the body, wailing loudly. Dash. On a hill outside the Tiger Fang camp, Todd Flowers turned to Samwell. "My lord, you shouldn't have accepted Chimon's loyalty," he said. Without taking his eyes off the camp below, Samwell asked, "And what sort of man is Chimon?" "A man who would kill his own kin." Todd replied gravely. "Anyone who would murder his own family is capable of anything." Samwell gestured toward the camp. "How many men would you need to take that camp?" Todd hesitated, then answered, "About 500. And casualties?" "They would be significant," Todd admitted. Samwell sighed. "Yet Chimon can give us that camp without us losing a single man." Todd frowned. "But why do we need it, my lord? After that last battle, neither the Tiger Fangs nor any of the other tribes would dare challenge us. We can build our settlement in peace." Samwell gave a silent sigh. Some things were beyond Todd's understanding. Growing slowly would take too long, and the world was descending into chaos faster than he had time to wait. So he needed people, and fast. Absorbing the wildlings was the quickest way. Taking control of the Tiger Fang tribe, the most powerful and respected tribe nearby, would be a significant step in bringing the wildlings under his rule. Just then, the camp gates opened, and several wildlings approached Samwell's position. Chimon led them. He walked up to Samwell and knelt, proclaiming, "Respected Lord Caesar, as the new chieftain of the Tiger Fang tribe, I submit all our people to you." Samwell stepped forward, his tone solemn. "I, Samwell Caesar, in the sight of the gods, accept the people of the Tiger Fang tribe as my subjects. From this day forth, you shall provide for me, and in turn, I shall protect you." End of chapter.
Thanks for listening.